Well, the haters gonna hate, 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 and the fakers gonna fake, 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 baby. I'm just gonna make, making luck, a Dominion podcast.
Making luck, Megasode. Welcome to Making Luck, a Dominion podcast. This is Wandering Winder. You might notice it's just me. And normally we call these episodes which don't have multiple co-hosts, don't particularly have kingdoms at the beginning or the end. Normally we call them mini-sodes, but as you can tell, this is a 555-minute podcast episode. So I don't want to call it a mini-sode, I'm calling it a megasode. But anyway, we're here to talk about the newest released set of Dominion, the newest expansion, that is Dominion Menagerie, which has nothing to do with the card Menagerie, which is from the small expansion Dominion Cornucopia, other than they're both Dominion related. Anyway, let's just jump right in, shall we? So Dominion Menagerie, I'm not sure if it's actually even released at this point in physical paper form. I know that it's been out online for some amount of time. I'm going to be honest with you, we're in the middle of a pandemic right now. The passage of time seems highly irregular to me, so it's been like, I don't know, a week or 2 weeks. So I've played some games with almost everything, and a couple of games with several of the things. I've watched several games as well. But these are pretty fresh takes. They're not the scalding hot takes. If you want my scalding hot takes, like right off BAM, when I saw for the first time each of the cards, you could check out on my YouTube channel. There is a playlist of my Dominion Menagerie scalding hot takes. But these are my, well, you might call them takes of various temperature, lukewarm takes, second impressions. Had some discussion with other people, seen them in some amount of games, but still fairly early on impressions of the contents of the set. So what I'm going to cover here, I'm going to be talking about ratings in general, rating systems, my feelings on those and how they're going to play into the rest of the review. Then I'm going to talk about the new mechanics in this set. There's 3 major new mechanics in the set. Obviously, there's a lot of new mechanics that are specific to individual cards. I'll take those as I get them, but there's a few kind of big ones. I'm going to talk a little bit about how existing cards and events have changed in strength. And then I'm going to go through the contents of the set. There's 3 different kinds of things in the set. There's ways. I'll describe what ways are in a bit when I talk about the mechanics. And then there's events. And then finally, I'm going to be talking about the cards. So, like I say, let's jump right in and talk about ratings. So ratings suck. Which is to say, I don't like ratings that much. And let me tell you why. So, what's the idea or concept of a rating? The concept of a rating is to tell you how good something is, right? And you could say, well, rankings give me some ordering of this is better than that, and that's fine. That has some amount of usefulness. Ratings tell you, I think, a bit more because they also tell you how much better. But there's a couple of problems. First of all, those ratings and rankings are all given in the abstract, right? I'm telling you that Village is a 7 out of 10 in the abstract. The thing is, you never play a game of Dominion, or especially get into a situation in a game of Dominion, which is abstract. It's always concrete. Always what your opponent has, what your draws have been, what's left in your deck, what is available on the board, how many cards are left in each pile. All of these things affect how good a card is to take, right? Affect your decision on what you should be taking. And so you could talk about raw power, but context is incredibly important all the time, right? It could be that, there's no terminals in this game. So Village is not a very good card. Or there's a lot of terminals in this game, So Village is a good card. There's no other actions in this game. King's Court is terrible. Obviously, most of the time, King's Court is very good. So there's some problems situationally. There's also some problems on that are more situational to, okay, Chapel is really good on turn 1. On turn 15, I probably don't want another Chapel. How does that affect my rating? I'm still going to give it a super high rating because it's really good overall, but that doesn't mean that at any given point in the game, a Chapel is what you want. You know, Village has the reverse thing. It's pretty bad on turn 1, but it's often very good later in the game. Province is great on turn 12 or turn 15 or whatever. It's pretty bad on turn 3 usually. So it's all very situational, right? So that's one problem with ratings, or at least with relying on them too much. The other problem, which is I think harder to solve, is you have different kinds of classes of cards, right? So there's some cards that are usually quite bad, but sometimes they're amazingly good. Think of Counting House, right? Counting House is usually a card that is actively bad in your deck, or at least very close to actively bad in your deck. It's terminal, it only pulls back coppers, you need to have it at the bottom of the shuffle, you need to have coppers in your discard, you usually don't want to have many coppers in your discard, etc., right? It's usually pretty bad. But sometimes it's very, very good, right? With Counting House and Traveling Fair, you get this combo of cards where Counting House is amazing and is very fast and very powerful, right? Or with Night Watchman, it's pretty good. There's some other situations where, like, there's Colony or Dominate and Mountebank and No Trashing, where it can get you a lot of money sometimes. And then there's some niche applications with, like, In, and you can always set up to have the thing at the bottom of your shuffle. You pull back coppers, and then you use it as some kind of draw with filtering or something, right? It's convoluted, but it comes up a non-zero number of games. It's come up like 3 games for me or something, right? And then there's some weird niche applications in between, yada yada. The point is, it's usually quite bad, but sometimes it's very, very good. So how does that compare to a card which is usually fine, but not like significantly helping you out? I'm trying to think of a card that comes in this situation, like Lab, right? And I think Lab is a better card because it's pretty good usually, but it's usually not as high impact as, say, something like Counting House when Counting House is great, or maybe a card that's a little bit weaker. Maybe a card like, you know, Herbalist. Herbalist is usually pretty bad. It has a combo with Capital, and other than that, maybe a little bit of usefulness on Crown, but the biggest use is just if it's the only plus buy on the board and you want plus buy, it's very good. I don't know. How do those things compare? It's hard to tell. Or there's a card like Duchess. Duchess is a card where I get like 20 or 30% more than a lot of other strong players, because I think it's better than nothing in a lot of situations, but it's almost never a high impact card. So is it very good because I take it, you know, half of my games? Well, I take it more often than Counting House, but the impact is so low, I might rate Counting House higher. I don't know. And then there's also things like cost comes into play. So a lot of 5 costs are better than 3 costs, but they cost 5 and they compete with each other. Now, if I have 5, I'm probably taking a 5 cost, but sometimes if I have 5, I should still take a 3 cost because it's still the best thing for my deck right now. So there's cost versus effect, and how do you balance that? Anyway, the point is it's really hard to get all of these ratings. The biggest thing I think to me is the situationality, but there's a lot of problems with ratings. Anyway, people like ratings because it gets some general value levels, and I've been ranting a lot. So I'm going to give ratings. I'm just saying I'm going to talk about the cards, and I think that's understanding the context of that. I'm going to talk about when I think they're going to be good and give some verbal description of how I think how good they are. And I think that's going to be a lot better than the points out of 10 I give. Also, I haven't sat down and carefully planned out my points out of 10, so it's very possible that I'm going to end up giving something a 6 out of 10 and something else a 7 out of 10, and I actually think the 6 out of 10 is stronger. Like, hopefully I'll be fairly well calibrated on this. I guess the other thing, I'm going to rant more about ratings. The other thing is, right, what does 7 out of 10 mean? In the abstract, it means like nothing, right? Who knows? It should mean that it's better than a 6 out of 10, but also better is hard to define. I'm going to hopefully, I think generally my philosophy of what makes a card better is how often you need to get it. Basically, if you don't get it, how much your win rate suffers. So that's trying to balance between how often you get it and how much impact it has when you get it. But it's not an easy thing to do, and obviously it's just a wild guess. So, anyway, the stupid numbers, don't pay too much attention to them, but I'm going to give them because people want them. Yada yada. Okay, thanks. Let's move on to mechanics. There's three big structural mechanics in this set, Dominion Menagerie. And let's just take them in turn, in whatever order I've set them out here, which is to start with Exile. Exile says, well, basically, it doesn't say anything, but when you exile a card, it goes from wherever it was, so you exile a card from your hand or from the supply or wherever you're exiling it from. It goes from there to the exile mat, right? I might call it the exile zone at some points, but it's a mat in case it matters that it's a mat. At some point, it's a mat. So at the point you exile it, if it wasn't your card, it becomes your card. So if you're exiling it from the supply, then it becomes your card. That mostly matters for like scoring at the end of the game. If it's still in exile when the game ends, you count it towards your score. Whether that matters for gardens or wall or palace or whatever it may be, right? It's going to count for scoring if it's in exile. Notably, there's some cards where you might exile victory cards. Those still score for you in exile. So having a province in exile is a great place to have a province because um, it scores its points, but it doesn't clog up your deck. So it's fantastic to have that in exile. Okay, great. The other thing about exile, though, the other part of the rules is that if you have a card in exile and you gain a copy of that card, then you can discard all copies of that card you have on the exile mat. So you don't have to do this, but if you want to discard at least one of them, you have to discard all of them, right? So if I have 3 golds in exile and I gain a gold, I can either discard those 3 golds from exile into my discard pile, or I can discard none of them, but I can't discard only 1 or 2, okay? So that's important to note. What's really important here is that when you exile a card, even if it wasn't yours before and it's becoming yours, it is not gaining the card by the rules purposes. So anything that counts on when you gain a card doesn't happen when you're exiling it, and it also doesn't happen when you discard it. So for one thing, if I have a gold in exile and I exile another gold, I haven't gained a gold, so they're both in exile and I can't get either of them back. I need to gain a gold in some way, and that doesn't include exile in order to get them off the mat. Okay, you can exile cards other than gold. It's just gold is a card that is exilable by some cards, and it is a card that's always available. So that's just the use that I'm doing. So okay, so that's, I think, hopefully the main deal on exile. I'm not going to try to cover in depth all edge cases of anything here because it's just going to be a 38-hour podcast if I do. So hopefully that's the main bit of exile. Let's move on to the next mechanic, which is horses. Horse is a card. It costs 3, but it's not in the supply. So the cost of 3 mostly matters just for like trash for benefit cards. Because you can never buy it. So it's not in the supply. It costs 3. It gives you plus 2 cards, plus an action, and you return the horse to its pile. Basically, it's exactly like the card from Renaissance that's Experiment, but it doesn't come with, you only get 1 at a time. Experiments, you get 2. And of course, horses aren't in the supply, so you can't buy them. And it doesn't count as an empty pile towards the game ending. The horse pile comes with 30 as well. There's 30 horses in the horse pile, so it's less likely to run out than that experiment pile for a couple reasons. But it can run out. So if it runs out and something tells you to gain a horse, you don't. The way you gain horses is there are cards and events that tell you to gain horses, and yeah, that's it. So a little bit of broad general strength on horses. It's kind of like the equivalent of a plus card token. So if you had villagers, which are kind of like the equivalent of a plus villager token, coffers, which are, a plus coin token, horses are kind of like that, but there's some important differences. I guess I should explain why they're kind of like that. So you gain the horse and you have to draw the horse, which gives you a card down because you drew that instead of another card. And then you play it and you draw 2 cards. So then you're +2. So you're a -1, you're +2. You end up with a +1 card. So if I have my 5 card hand and it has a horse in it, I'm minus a card because it took up one of those 5 slots in my hand. I play it and now I have a 6 card hand. So it's like I had 1 extra card. The way it's not like a token is tokens you can use more or less whenever. But that's not true for the horses. You have to draw them first. Also, you gain them, so if there's things that care about you playing an action or having an action in your deck, you can trash them for trash for benefit stuff. Gaining an action, having the action in your deck, there's things that count about having a card in your deck. There are things that care about that sometimes, and horses matter for that. But also you have to play them. You can play them, so there's plus and minuses. I think generally it would be better to have a token because it's totally on demand, but there's some pluses to having the action cards as well. Yeah, that's horses. So finally, the last mechanic is ways. So ways are landscapes. The sideways card things like events and projects and landmarks. They're sideways, so that you only get 1 copy of each of them in your little box. There are 20 of them. They all start with way of the, so way of the horse, way of the owl, way of the sheep, way of the seal, etc., etc. In order to determine how many you get per game, if you're following the recommendations, I mean, you can do whatever you want. You can play with none of them. You can choose however you want to make your kingdoms. But if you're following the recommendations, then they do follow the existing landscape rules, so they count as one of your up to 2 landscapes, and you deal them out from the deck along with the randomizers. But you're suggested to not have more than 1 way in a single game. So if you deal out a second way before you get a different landscape and before you get to the 10 cards, you don't include the second one if you're following the rules. So the big thing, I guess I should explain what ways do. When you play an action card in a game that has a way in it, you can either get the action card's normal effect, or you can choose to take the way effect instead. So one of the ways, way of the sheep gives you +2 money. So if I have a village, I play the village, I can either choose to take my +1 card and +2 actions from the normal village effect, or I can choose to take 2 money by playing it using the way of the sheep. I get to choose that, and I have to choose it when I play the card. Okay? So the biggest thing that the ways give you is optionality. Most of the ways are not strong enough that you would buy a card that just had that text as an action very often. Also, only actions. If I haven't mentioned it, I think I have, but I want to emphasize only actions can be played using ways. So and only when you could play an action anyway, so you can't play it during your buy phase unless it was also a treasure or something. You can't play victory cards using this unless they were already actions, etc., etc. The big strength of them is the optionality because, like I say, one of them is +2 money, and you're almost never buying an action card that's +2 money terminally. We talked about Duchess before, but I usually gain Duchess for free off of a duchy. The discard of the Duchess is probably not that big a deal, and it's not that strong of a card. So they're about that strength, right? I think the +2 money might even be one of the stronger ones. Maybe, although maybe not. We'll get to them in a bit. Note that rules-wise for these, the card is still in play. You play it using the way of the sheep or the way of the horse or whatever. Well, not way of the horse. That's a bad example. But way of the sheep, and the card is in play. Um, so any while in play effects on the card still happen. So we're looking at you, Highway, we're looking at Goons, we're looking at Haggler, right? Any of those have, there's some other cards as well. They have effects that say, while this is in play, it's still in play. So if I play a Highway, it's in play, so it gives me the cost reduction, even if I take the way effect instead of the plus a card plus an action. Okay, so that's the mechanics. Let's now talk about how existing things change in their strength. So existing cards get stronger or weaker based on context, right? I talked about context before, and context is really important for determining how strong different things are. I want to go again reemphasize that ratings are not so useful because they're abstract. But the big problem was why they weren't useful is because context matters, and I'm trying to give an abstract rating. That is because that's like trying to average out across all contexts given the card pool that we have. And given the release of a new set, the card pool changed semi-significantly. Obviously, what actually matters is what's actually in the game and what actual situation you're in. We can talk about, do things change strength because new things get printed? In some sense, they do the same thing still, right? Unless there's some kind of an errata, everything still does the same thing. So it hasn't changed how it functions at all. And so to some extent, it's just as strong as it was before. Having said that, well, a couple things. The scale might change because I'm trying to do a 1 to 10 scale or a 0 to 10 scale, let's say. Then what is a 10, right? If I suddenly print a donate that costs 0 debt instead of 8 debt, then it's incredibly strong and stronger than anything else that we've seen before. If I print 20 new cards at that power level or 50 new cards at that power level, then what was a 10 before, I need now to have something that's 11, or I need to move those things down. I'm not really worrying about that so much, but that's one reason why you might think things change. The other reason why things might change in power level is because the context changes. And so, right, if they print a new set that has 300 villages in it, every village tends to get a little bit weaker because the scarcity of needing this particular village is much less important. Terminals get a lot stronger because you always have village, or almost always have village support for them. So context matters for that reason. Talk about, did Chapel get worse when Donate was printed? Well, it does the same thing. When you have a Donate board, you're less likely to get Chapel. So to the extent that Donate might also be in the Kingdom, Chapel kind of got worse on average. But again, this is why the context of a particular game is important, because if Donate isn't in the Kingdom, it doesn't really matter that Donate got printed, right? So things don't change that much from a new set. Like the overall, especially at this point, the overall card pool isn't changing that much. Having said that, there have been some things that have changed before, right? Overall, just things are stronger now than they were when, say, Base Dominion was printed. You don't have Thief, you don't have Scout. I mean, Scout wasn't around till Intrigue, but you don't have these super weak cards, so boards in general are stronger, which changes the overall power level of what's, viable. Big money with no other action cards was almost never viable, but it's even rarer now. Chapel, I think, actually has gotten a tad weaker, although I think I'd still give it a 10 out of 10. It has gotten a tad weaker just because not only is there Donate, but there's a lot of other trashing options, which are, most of them aren't quite as good as Chapel, but there's some alternatives for which, there's a combination of things where you might skip Chapel for, and there's Donate and Cathedral and Goat and enough other things that, whatever. So there's various things that things have changed over time. Things are stronger now is a big thing. Haunted Woods, when Nocturne got printed, right? There's all these night cards, and Haunted Woods basically shuts down the night phase pretty well. So that made Haunted Woods stronger. The level of Alt VP has gone up and down and back and around. So like Rebuild, I think, is weaker now than when Dark Ages came out. Part of that's because other stuff has gotten stronger. Part of that's because weaker stuff has been removed. Part of that's because there was more alt VP, particularly that came out with empires, and that gave you more ways to be able to fight rebuild. Um, so anyway, things change over time. I'm not going to talk too much about existing cards changing that much, but there's a few big things that made some significant changes. I think probably about as much as any set release that we've seen for a bit. And the biggest thing is ways here. So ways give your action cards optionality. That makes, well, action cards stronger in general because they can still do exactly what they did before, but they also can do a little bit other stuff. If you're playing with the normal full random following the suggestions, you're going to have a way about 28.5% of the time. That's about 2/7 of games, so that's like pretty frequently. I mean, still, most of the time you're not going to have a way, but it's going to be a non-trivial amount of the time that you will. So it makes action cards better in general, but in particular, it's going to make action cards which have low opportunity cost or easy to get, and which the effects themselves were weak or situational, a bit better. So the things that I think get the most better are Death Cart. Death Cart gives you 3 action cards. If the way is really good, then you might just want to stick as many action cards as you can into your deck. It makes something like Skulk better because you probably got the Skulk mostly for the cheap gold, and now you can have something that's better than just +2 buys and a Hex, which is a pretty weak action to start with. Rats, now you can play a Rats without it necessarily giving you another Rats, so hooray for Toby. Also, it's a way to get a lot of actions into your deck cheaply for those cases where it's good. Stuff with on-gain effects, right? So Lackeys, a big part of Lackey's power is the on-gain 2 villagers. Now you can use it as something else than +2 cards some of the time, although one of the ways is just +2 cards anyway, so but things that are cheap or things that are situational, you could have Stonemason, you have Treasure Map, which is highly situational, Lurker, because you kind of don't want to play a single Lurker a lot of the times. Lurker is a situational card. There's a number of these situational cards like this. Those get a little bit better. Counting House could get better. Beggar could get better, right? In certain situations, they do a lot for you, but a lot of times they don't. Some stuff gets weaker. So Cultist and Marauder give out ruins. If you have a way that's strong, giving out ruins might not be as bad. A lot of times it's still going to be bad, and it's still going to be that Cultist and Marauders are good, but sometimes it's not so bad, right? And there's a couple of these ways where it's just like not bad at all, or actually helpful to give them ruins. So do watch out for that. Those are things to watch out for. Enchantress. Playing a card as a way beats Enchantress. You still get the way effect. So that's a little bit worse, although the attack still hurts in a lot of cases because I think most of the time you're not going to want to use the action for the way effect. Most of the time you want it for the effect that's printed on the card. Stonemason, if I didn't mention it, is a thing. Horses also change some things. They're kind of easy to get. They make something like Academy better because there are a lot of cards that let you gain horses repeatedly or multiple horses. And that gives you a lot of village effect with Academy. Academy probably didn't need it, but whatever. Vineyards, you might have some extra horses in your deck at the end of the game. The biggest thing for horses is probably Procession. Processing a horse gains you a 4 cost. The horse was going away anyway, and you've drawn 4 cards and gotten 2 actions. It's a really good deal. Like, processioning experiments was really good before. Processioning horses is really good now. Exile depends on how it's used. There's no big overall things for Exile. Yeah, I don't know what to tell you. But mostly just think about the games that you get in with them. Anyway, Let's move on. I've been talking enough about general stuff. Let's talk about specific cards and card-shaped objects, starting with ways. And I know that I said I was going to give ratings. I'm not going to give ratings on ways, though, because ratings are all about trying to choose whether I'm going to do this or that or the other. And I guess it makes more sense for ways than it did for, say, landmarks, but you're never choosing to buy a way or not, so I'm not going to give you ratings for them. So let's just jump right in with Way of the Butterfly. Way of the Butterfly is a way that says you may return this, so the card you're playing using the Way of the Butterfly, you may return this to its pile to gain a card costing exactly one more than it. Yeah, so cards which are situational and not very good in your deck, you can get rid of with the Way of the Butterfly. Ruins, you can self-trash, I guess. Terminally, that's not very effective way of dealing with them, especially if it's coming from like cultist, because you're just gonna get them back. And you get again a one cost, which is Poorhouse if that's on the board. But that's not the main use of this card, I don't think. The main use is going to be like, say I had a Trasher early on, and now I'm thin, and the Trasher doesn't do anything for me anymore. I can get rid of it and get a more useful card for my deck. So Swell, like my Chapel turns into a silver, or an Oracle, or whatever 3 cost I want it to be. So that's pretty nice in those situations. The other thing you can do, so like again with Skulk or Rats or whatever, you've got those usefulness. The other thing you can do is just get a card, an action card that costs an amount, as a way to gain a more expensive card. So this is the classic thing with Feast, which was a 4-cost action from the base first edition game, and all you did was trash it to get a 5 cost. So that's basically back. Instead of trashing it, you're returning it to the supply, but basically you can do that with any 4 cost now. You could do it for a 5 cost to get a 6 cost. You can do it with a 3 cost to get a 4 cost, etc., etc., etc. It returns to the supply. You can use this, I guess, in some rare cases to unempty a supply pile if you're trying to delay the end of the game. So I guess keep that in mind, although I don't think that's going to come up super often. I think 4 into 5 is likely going to be the most common use for this, in which case it is like exactly like Feast. So many of you may not have played with Feast or may not remember it very well. If you open with Feast Silver, you have only an 8.8% chance to hit 6 or more, which is a lot down from opening Silver. But to get a 5 cost or more, you're very likely opening Feast Silver, or in this case any 4 cost with Silver. You're 94.9% to get your 4 cost or your 5 cost to get at least one of them, and to get 2 of them, you're actually 34.3%. So you get a lot more 5s than opening Silver. And in compensation, you don't have the Silver in your deck, which might hurt not so much. Some cases, some people think that's a good thing. I don't think it's very often going to be a good thing, or at least not very good, but the ability to get the extra 5 may well be worth it pretty often. So consider opening the 4 for this, with this around, if you want a 5 or want multiple 5s. Also, at the end of the game, you can get duchies with this instead of getting the play effect. Right? You can turn the play effect into gain a duchy instead, which is powerful in some cases at the end of the game. Obviously, it's terminal, so keep in mind for that. Or turning a 7 cost into a province might also come up. As for if you're trying to do the Feast thing to get a 5 cost, I think you'd still usually want to get a 4 cost that's probably good for your deck, because sometimes, right, you have the optionality, and this is the big power for most of these ways, is sometimes you might choose, I'm going to play it for the play effect. So if it is some kind of a terminal Silver, you get a monument or something, if I'm going to hit 5 anyway, then I probably would rather have the monument in my deck or not, so I just play it if I have the money to hit 5 again. Maybe I would rather have a 3 than it, so I don't play it. I use the Way of the Butterfly and then buy a 2 or a 3 anyway. But it gives you some optionality, right? So if there's a card that is situational you might want, again, Skulk is great with this, Rats is great with this, but I give it a butterfly out of 10. We'll move on next to the Way of the Camel. So Way of the Camel, it says exile a gold from the supply. Yeah, that's not great, but surprisingly it helps a lot in some cases. If you want to add payload, you get to the end of your deck, playing a few things for, like, you've drawn your deck, so you have some draw. Playing a few things for Camel is often going to get you better payload next turn if you then buy 1 gold than whatever else you were doing. I mean, I say often. I think it usually won't be the case, but it will be a non-trivial amount of the time that it's just like the best way to get the payload on the board. And some other times, like, you just build with a little bit of extra overdraw, and then you use Camel to convert some of those draw into payload for next turn. So I actually think this is pretty powerful in some cases, but you don't often build your deck around it. I'm going to give it a Camel out of 10. Next, we have Way of the Chameleon. Way of the Chameleon says follow this card's instructions. Each time that would give you plus cards this turn, you get plus coins instead, and vice versa. So this is like, if let's give some examples. If I play a patron and I use the Way of the Chameleon, I get the villager just like normal. I follow all the instructions, but where it says +2 money, I instead draw 2 cards. I get +2 cards, right? Similarly, if I played a smithy, I would normally get +3 cards with it, but if I've played it using the Way of the Chameleon, I get 3 money instead, right? Okay, so this is an incredibly powerful effect. Most typically, it's a little bit stronger to turn money into draw than draw into money. Having said that, the optionality is a big deal here. Note that mostly for peddlers, like the literal card peddler, it does basically nothing because the cards turn into money, but the money turns into cards, and you have the same amount of both. So, but the optionality is really good because it lets you have whatever you have in your deck. You draw your deck as much as possible, and then you have overdraw because you have these things that can produce either money or coins, and then you turn money or coins, that's the same thing. Money or draw, you turn all, once you've drawn your deck, you turn all of the draw into money. You turn money into draw to help you draw your deck. You turn draw into money once you have drawn your deck. So it basically just ups your reliability. And then efficiency wise, some things are costed such that they're assuming that they give you either money or cards, and you might want the other. Also situationally, you can say I really need cards right now, or I really need money right now, and I don't need the cards. So that's very powerful. But the biggest thing tends to be cards that give you more money than anything else, especially if they're non-terminal. So like Festival is a better Lost City with Chameleon, right? Because you can use it for money, A. B, like if you use it with Chameleon, you've drawn 2 cards, gotten 2 actions, and gotten a buy, right? It's just like a lot better. Like an activated conspirator turns into a lab that also gives you a money. So that's the main thing, but usually you're just going to build your deck in a way such that you draw your deck using Chameleon to increase your draw, and then you turn all your draw into money as much as you can. It's a very powerful effect. I will also note that there is one like significant synergy with Chameleon, which is Poorhouse. There might be some others, but Poorhouse, you get the 4 money, which draws you 4 cards, and then you lose 4 money, or you lose money per treasure in your hand, but you can't go below 0. So if you didn't have money before, then you're not really losing anything, and it's just like terminal draw 4 cards for 1, which is really good. Let's move on to Way of the Frog. Way of the Frog says +1 action. When you discard this from play this turn, put it onto your deck. As best I can tell, this just gives you a little bit of reliability if you have overdraw. I don't think it's often worth getting much overdraw for. So I think this is one of the weaker ways. Um, it does have a little bit of synergy with while in play effects, but you would rather have the top card of most of those things than +1 action. Like maybe it does something with Haggler, but you don't really want Haggler on the top of your deck very much. Yeah, and like you could try to play some kind of a golden deck with like 5 highways, which you can do. You just frog them every turn, but you can then gain some. You can buy something then that costs up to 5 normally every turn, which just isn't very good. Um, so I think mostly this is just to get a little bit of reliability. Or if you have too many terminals, you can punt one of the terminals for next turn if you have terminal collision. So that's something that's a little bit nice. It makes you a little bit more apt to open like double terminal, but not that much. Let's move on. Way of the Goat. Trash a card from your hand. Pretty simple. Yeah, so Trade Route is a bad card, and so this is not going to be something you want to get in action just to use Goat. But the optionality is pretty good if you have some extra action that's not going to do that much for you right now. You can trash a little bit here and there off the edges. It doesn't make you not want to get trashers normally. I don't think you still want more efficient trashing than this. But it can clean up the last little bit for something like Lookout, or it can trash your trashers. I mean, it's fine. Let's move on to Way of the Horse. Way of the Horse says +2 cards plus an action, return this to its pile. Note that this can return anything to its pile. It doesn't have to be a card from the supply. So this will return a Madman to its pile. I mean, you probably just want to play the Madman for the Madman effect. This will return a Mercenary to its pile. This will return prizes to their piles, to the prize pile rather. Returns everything except for things that don't have piles. So there's only a few cards that don't have piles. That's Necropolis, and the zombies from Necromancer. The zombies start in the trash rather than, in a pile. Trash is not a pile, so they don't. Anyway. And then it's anything from the black market, because the black market is a deck, not a pile. So if you're playing with black market, then any card is a lab. Any action you get from the black market is a lab. So you want to get whatever cheap action you can, probably, because it's a lab. A lab which can be used for its normal play effect, even. But just any way to get cheap actions is pretty decent with this. Any kind of way that you're getting ruins, right? So this is the thing that most counters Cultist or Marauder or what have you. Otherwise, you're just, I mean, sometimes you do this, but usually you put an action in your deck because you want the action in your deck. Sometimes you're desperate for an effect right now, but I don't think that you're actually going to use it that often. But the ability to do it when you want or need to, or for actions that have outlived their usefulness, is very powerful. Also with possession, when you're possessing them, you can choose to return all of their cards to all of their actions to the supply, which can be pretty brutal. So watch out for that. Let's move on to Way of the Mole. Way of the Mole is +1 action, discard your hand, +3 cards. Yeah, this is not that great, but it's like a little bit of a mini minion. Minion to draw stuff is, I mean, okay, it's one fewer card, which is a lot less, but it can be powerful in certain circumstances. If you're really digging for a particular important card, this helps you dig for it. You can do some draw to X stuff with this. Only 3 cards is a little bit sketch, but it's surprising how this can come up for you situationally, how often that happens. So it's a nice, useful little thing. It's probably not something you really want to build around a ton, although if the stuff to help you for your draw to X is really strong, you might do. But for the most part, it's going to be something you use situationally, and you use it situationally. Next is Way of the Monkey. Way of the Monkey plus a buy, plus a money. I mean, if you need plus buy, you use Way of the Monkey. Or if you've drawn your deck and you need a little more payload, use Way of the Monkey. I guess Necropolis works with a lot of these on turn 1, right? It gives you a little extra money, gives you the extra buy, whatever. It's good when you need it, but you don't want to build your deck around it unless it's like the only plus buy, probably. Way of the Mouse. Way of the Mouse says play the set aside card, leaving it there. As you might have guessed, there's a horizontal line, and below that it says setup. Set aside an unused action card costing 2 or 3. Way of the Mouse obviously varies wildly depending on what card it has chosen. Note that leaving it there makes a couple of things particularly strong. Mostly it's just like the strength of the set aside card, but there's a few things that are particularly strong and a couple of things that are weaker. So anything that has on gain is a little bit weaker, so lackeys, sorry. Border guard, the horn, where you stick the thing back on top of your deck, weaker. Travelers, you can't exchange them, so weaker. But things that would leave your deck upon playing tend to get stronger. So not embargo, because you can't ever... Embargo's actually weaker because you need to trash it to stick a token somewhere. So it's basically effectively +2 money because you can't ever trash it. But you can't ever trash acting troop, but you do get the villagers anyway, so that's powerful. Also, encampment, you never have to return it to the supply. So with encampment, any action card is like a lost city, which can let you reveal a gold or plunder, but I don't know why you would want to do that. I don't think there's any reason that you would do that. So, but anyway, if encampment is a set aside card, you just want to jam as many action cards in your deck as possible because lost cities are great. If experiment is a set aside card, you don't have to return it, so every action card turns into a lab. Not as good as Lost City, but still very good. Way of the Mouse, I think, is generally going to be very, very, very strong, but it obviously depends a lot on what's set aside. Let's move on to Way of the Mule. Way of the Mule is +1 action plus a money. This is mostly only useful for terminal collision, or I guess if you've overdrawn. It gives you a little bit of money. What is there to say? It's nice. You can situationally use it where you need 1 more money, and you would otherwise like play a village or something. Maybe you'd rather have the money and get to your price point. Okay, great. Way of the Otter. Way of the Otter just says +2 cards. Again, you're not going to build around this very often, although if villages are plentiful, you can. I don't know what to tell you. Look at it situationally. Way of the Owl. Draw until you have 6 cards in hand. This is the play effect of Watchtower. It's draw to X. Draw to X tends to not be strong. We talked about that in a super early episode of Making Luck. But situationally, draw to X can be strong. If you're playing your other stuff, right, it doesn't have to be a draw to X card, right? If I have a moat, then I can either draw 2 cards, or if drawing Way of the Owl would draw more than 2, I can play it with Way of the Owl. That's nice. It's good against discard attacks, etc. A lot of people seem to be really high on Way of the Owl. I think the situational aspect of it being situationally very good can be there, but overall I'm not super high on it. Just like you usually want to have more than 6 cards in your hand at most points in most games anyway. I don't know. Way of the Ox is +2 action, so it turns any action into an Acropolis. That can be very good if you have a lot of terminals or you really need villages, but typically you don't want to forego getting villages just because Ox is around if you can afford it, because Necropolis is pretty bad as far as villages go. But again, the optionality is nice, and you can build a little bit heavier on terminals to start with. Although do note that if you have a collision of exactly 2 terminals, Way of the Ox doesn't exactly help you unless one of them is a WoW in play, because, well, you played one of them as Ox, so you didn't really get its normal play effect anyway. Way of the Pig is +1 card +1 action. You can turn anything into a cantrip. This really does help you with getting more terminals, like over-terminaling a bit. Also, just the optionality to dig a little bit deeper with your payload cards is kind of nice, so that's cute. Way of the Rat. This rat does not look as friendly as Toby. You may discard a treasure to gain a copy of this, so it kind of is like a rat. Tends to be better than rats. You like to be able to gain cards that you already have in your deck in a lot of cases. Discarding a treasure is a real cost, but gain another copy of this might well be better than the play effect of a lot of actions in a lot of cases, particularly after you're getting to the point where like you are drawing your deck and you have drawn your deck. You usually don't want to like stop from drawing your deck to do this. It does have some synergy with draw to X stuff because it lets you discard the coppers. What more is there to say? Let's move on to Way of the Seal. Way of the Seal. Plus a money in this turn when you gain a card, you may put it onto your deck. Now this is a useful effect to have. It's not usually worth taking a terminal slot in your deck, I don't think, but again, situationally it can help your reliability a lot if you get to the point in the game where that's very important. And for some cards, it's more important than others, like Scrying Pool or City Quarter. You want to make sure you start with one so you can kick off. Way of the Sheep, plus 2 money. I mentioned this earlier. It lets you build with extra overdraw. And then, like if I have an extra village and smithy at the end, I get some money out of it, even if I'm not drawing with them. So it makes me want to build with more overdraw because I can turn some of my draw cards into money anyway and be more reliable than if I would have just taken payload instead, have more payload than if I had just taken overdraw instead. Way of the Squirrel. Way of the Squirrel says plus 2 cards at the end of this turn. Note that so it's kind of like duration draw, but there's a couple of differences. First of all, that's a very powerful effect. I think this is more powerful than most of the other draw effects, although the downside is that draw now tends to be better than draw later because, draw now gets me better things now, which makes my later turns better anyway. So that's one of the caveats. Another caveat is how it's different from duration draw. I draw at the end of the turn, so like after my cleanup, I draw a larger hand. It doesn't work with Donate. It does work with things like Outpost, but the difference from duration draw, it's more vulnerable to discard attacks. Most discard attacks make you discard down to like 3 cards in your hand. You're going to have to discard all the way to 3 from your 7, so the duration draw you would get at the start of your next turn, so that would be better in that case. But additionally, the thing that you squirreled doesn't have to stay out. So durations stay out, this thing doesn't, so you can squirrel every turn. So that's actually nice. Let's move on to Way of the Turtle. Way of the Turtle says set this aside if you did play it at the start of your next turn. The turn you're setting it aside has to be terminal, which is easy to forget. Just try to keep that in mind. Being able to set something aside is very powerful. Note that when you play it at the start of your next turn, you get to choose to turtle it again. So for one thing, this is a way to permanently get cards out of your deck if you don't want them anymore. So a trasher that's really not useful anymore, or isn't useful or isn't going to be useful now or for a while maybe, but it can get ruins out of your deck. You do have to play them once and terminally, but you can keep them out of your deck forever. But also, right, it just gives you a village effect the next turn, right? If I have a tiny bit of overdraw to where I have like 1 extra cantrip or something, right? I can turtle the last one, and then the next turn I'm going to have plus a card plus an action. I'm going to start with a 6-card hand and, two actions. It's like I started with I've played a Lost City at the start of my turn, right? So that's quite good, quite a powerful potential effect. You can even sometimes use this as a way to be a village for like a mega turn. It's like pretty scraping the bottom of the barrel for those purposes. But like the village effect and lining stuff up is very nice. Thrones or King's Courts or processions or whatever. Lining up combinations of cards. The village effect. And sometimes if there's no village on the board, maybe even no draw on the board, you can, like say with a bridge, you can mega turn with this vaguely similarly to how you can with Royal Carriage, although I think it's probably not quite as good as the Royal Carriage version. Let's move on to Way of the Worm. Way of the Worm just says exile an estate from the supply. Scores you a point without making your deck worse. It's very similar to a VP token in that regard. It's not a very powerful effect in general, but sometimes you weren't going to play your action for much of an effect anyway, and the point is nice. It also sometimes gives you some amount of pile control, as an estate pile out is sometimes what you're looking for. As a pile out that scores you enough points to overcome like a one province deficit. So this is going to help you with that, just because it's, kind of like gain an estate, but you're exiling it. It's a little bit better, obviously, with things that at least some of the things that care about estates. So like pasture, it scores 2 points instead of 1. Although with shepherd, you might actually want the estate in the deck. You can discard from exile that way. If you if you actually gain an estate at some point, so that's something there. But also things that care about estates could be like triumph. Now again, exiling is not gaining, so it won't help you get your triumph to be bigger. But it can help deny estates for triumph or for wild hunt. And sometimes with like inheritance and baron, estates come up a little bit more, although that's pretty thin. Anyway, that does it for ways. Let's move on to events. Oh my goodness, this is taking forever. But what did I expect? There's 20 events. Let's just dive in. Delay, cost 0. It says you may set aside an action card from your hand at the start of your next turn and play it. It's kind of similar to Turtle in that way, but it costs a buy. It costs a buy. Keep that in mind. When buys are free, this is pretty good. Normally you want to play most of your actions most turns. I don't think this is that great overall. It can kind of help terminal collision, but it takes your buy up, so you usually would want to buy a card rather than this. It can kind of work with Tactician a little bit, or because you get to, if you have multiple buys, it can work with Tactician, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. Other than that, I mean, you really want plus buys for this to be good. You can set up mega turns with this, maybe like bridge, and then you delay a bridge, and then you delay some bridges, and you can get more bridges. But you really need plus buys, and it's, I mean, you could do this multiple times a turn. You get that duration-y summon-like effect, but costing a buy and and having to draw and not play the action on a turn is a real cost. So I don't think this is that great overall. I'm going to give it a 4 out of 10. Desperation, 0 cost, once per turn, only once per turn. You may gain a curse. If you do, plus a buy and plus 2 money. So yeah, the biggest thing is that this helps you open with a 5 or a 6, which is often worth taking a curse for if the 5 or the 6 is particularly strong. But you don't want to do this very often because taking a lot of curses is bad. So like if it lets you open with Sentry or Recruiter, it's probably, or something like that, it can often be worth it, I think. Altar, something that's very powerful like that, but you definitely want to limit. I mean, it depends on, how good the 3 and 4 cost options are as well. You definitely want to limit, though, how many curses you're taking, because taking a curse in your deck is a big cost. Once the curses run out, you effectively can't do this anymore as well, right? You can choose, there's a weird edge case here, you can choose to take this and not gain the curse. You won't get the buy or the money. You can choose to not gain the curse even if there's curses left. You won't get the buy or the money. The edge case where you might want to do that is you want to get a messenger and not have to give both players something. It's incredibly thin, but that's there. Rules-wise, you do have the option. In the end game, maybe you don't have much time to see the curse, and you really want to spike the province, so you desperation then again. With Watchtower, it's great. With Trader, it can be very good because it's 2 money and you gain a silver instead of a curse. No, actually, it doesn't work with Trader because Trader is you would gain, not you did gain. So scrap that Trader thought. Although this is the other, I guess, edge case for this. Um, you can buy a desperation attempt to gain a curse, gain a silver instead. You don't get the money or the whatever, but or the buy, but it's a way to um, gain a silver with trader on, say, a mission turn where you couldn't buy a card. Also incredibly thin. Yeah, I'm gonna give this a 6 out of 10. It's strong, but you don't want to use it too often. Gamble. Gamble costs 2. It says plus a buy, reveal the top card of your deck. If it's a treasure or action, you may play it. Otherwise, discard it. So keep in mind, if it's a treasure or action and you don't play it, it's not exactly clear from the wording here, but you do discard it, right? You don't put it back on top, you discard it instead if you choose to not play it. So you're usually going to play it, but you might not, I guess. So this, I think, is actually an incredibly powerful effect. Incredibly powerful. I think this is one of, if possibly the strongest event in the set. Now, why? It doesn't look that great. So there's a few use cases for gamble. One, you're drawing your deck, you buy a few cards, you gamble to trigger a shuffle. So you've stacked the top of your deck with good cards. It costs you 2 money to do that, but you have, and one of your cards gets discarded, but you then have, like, say you buy 2 villages in this, you've basically top decked one of the villages. Okay, so that's not a world beater, because it's like a little bit worse than traveling fair in that case, probably, but it's something you can do, and maybe you can stack multiple cards depending on how much you're getting this turn. That's one thing it does. That's not that great. Another thing it does, though, is if you're buying payload, and the payload is a card that produces more than 2 money, then you can gamble. Then, if you've drawn your deck, I buy a gold, and then I gamble. It costs me 2. I make 3 back. I've just gained a money. It didn't cost me a buy because I got the buy back. So it basically makes your payload cards a little bit cheaper. Cheaper by the amount they produce minus 2. So if it makes 4, then it's 2 cheaper. If it makes 3, it's 1 cheaper. If it makes 5, it's 3 cheaper, etc., etc., etc. If you've drawn your deck, right? So that's nice. But I actually think the bigger thing is when you're not drawing your deck, then you can gamble to cycle a bit and or find your important cards more often. I guess that's mainly the point of cycling anyway. But there was some discussion of, okay, so it's a chapel board. Turn 1, I can gamble. And let's say I had a 3-4. I gamble. There's a 4/5 chance that I find a copper, in which case I have 2 money, and then I can buy my chapel. And then there's a 1/5 chance I chapel on turn 2, in that case, which is great. All the other times I'm chapeling on turn 3. Or most of the other times, at least, I'm chapeling on turn 3. I haven't work out the math particularly, but you get to your chapel faster. You get shorter shuffles, and you get to do your stuff much faster. You can do this with on a 4-3 and then if you miss the copper, then it's kind of sad. On a 4-3, you can gamble and then buy chapel. But you also might gamble on turn 2 to trigger the shuffle, right? And then you either hit the chapel and can trash a little bit early, or you don't hit the chapel and then you have this nice short shuffle with chapel in it after turn 2. So you have to figure out which of those is better, but you have to start thinking about that from turn 1. So, it helps to have cheap cards in these scenarios, but in general, right, early on in the game, I can pay 2 to either get a money back because I've skipped to either I'm only paying 1 because I got the money back and I'm skipping a copper, which is a nice thing, or I'm skipping an estate and it costs 2, which is also a nice thing. Now, 2 is a lot, but sometimes there's good cheapish things around, and being able to cycle through to find your really important things more quickly is really good. Typically in those cases, I'm not sure that you actually want to hit your important things, but it's not that bad if you do, because if I hit a silver, okay, I've gotten my money back. I've skipped the silver which is not something I want to do, but I'm more likely than not I'm not going to in the early game. Anyway, it's quite a good thing. But note that if the important cards are drawing cards or giving plus actions, it's not going to help so much because unless I'm drawing a night card or I have a way to go back into my action phase, um, then like if I draw a treasure, I can't play it because I've already bought something. So just keep that in mind. Uh, Nevertheless, I think this is a very powerful effect. I'm going to give it a 9 out of 10. 9. Pursue. Pursue is an event that costs 2 plus a buy. Name a card, reveal the top 4 cards from your deck, put the matches back, and discard the rest. So this has somewhat similar applications to Gamble in some of the cases. It helps you to top deck a thing to make you more reliable once you're drawing your deck. You can top deck multiple copies of the same thing. So that's similar. And then early on, it goes further in letting you find your key card more. But you really have to plan ahead because you're not just advancing 1 or 2 cards. You have to look at 4 to figure out A, what you want to name, because maybe I don't want to trigger the shuffle earlier. Maybe I do, maybe I don't. I don't know. You have to think about it. So like on turn 3, I could pursue, but maybe I pursue for copper because I want to skip my estates. I don't know. Or maybe but then maybe you missed the good card that you actually want to find. So you probably don't do that. You probably pursue for the good card, but then the good card is going to miss the shuffle probably. And so, okay, it's a faster shuffle, but so there's ups and downs, but I think there are situations if you plan multiple turns ahead that you make good use out of this. And there are certain times where like you're only going to skip, say you skip 3 cards and that doesn't make you shuffle, like on turn 5 or 6 or something. You can use this effectively. I guess Gamble had some synergies with discard stuff with like Tunnel. Pursue has some synergies with reveal and discard stuff as well. Tunnel, you can make maybe a lot of golds, maybe. Patron it reveals. So you can pursue a lot of times for patrons and start to print coffers. You can't respend those coffers to keep pursuing and therefore go infinite, usually. But there are, like with Villa, you might be able to go very, very high. You have a lot of money, you pursue poor patrons to the top. You spent all your money pursuing patrons to the top to convert into villagers, and you're picking up a couple villagers every time, and then you buy Villa. And then you can spend all of those coffers to do it all more and more and more and just get a ton of money that way. So that's a nice little combo. But anyway, I think Pursue is strong, but not as strong as Gamble. 7 or 8. I'm going to go 7 out of 10. Let's go next with Ride. Ride's a 2-cost action, or not action, 2-cost, and it says gain a horse. It's an event. Yeah, it's solid. It's kind of like Expedition that's weaker. Half of an Expedition that's a little bit cheaper. Also costs a buy though, and it's delayed. I mean, that's solid, but it's not spectacular. I'm gonna give it a 6 out of 10. Toil. I guess like all of the events have things that combo with being events. Toil. Plus a buy, you may play an action card from your hand. I think this is actually pretty weak. People seem to be pretty high on it, but it reminds me a bit of how people were high on capitalism. And okay, I know Adam still says capitalism is a 10 out of 10. I don't think capitalism's that good. I don't think this is that good. It does give you this village effect, but the thing is it costs you 2 money. Most of the terminals I have in my deck do one of 2 things. They draw me cards, which after I've bought something is less useful unless, of course, again, I have something like Villa that lets me go back into my action phase, or I have something like Night cards is what I'm drawing. So drawing cards is not very useful to Toil very much. Or I guess I just want to cycle through the deck. Like you might do it sometimes, but it's not going to be very good very often, I don't think. Or the other big thing that terminals do for me is give me econ, but the econ it gives me is lessened by 2 money. So that's some value. Like if I If I toil a monument, I'm still getting the VP chip. If I toil a swindler, I'm still getting the attack, but it's not making me money. So it's like a lot worse than playing the swindler or the monument generally, or the militia or whatever those terminal silvers are. If it makes more than two money, it gets me a little bit of money. Toil does, but it's not a lot very often. Now there's some ancillary effects there. It's very good to be able to do that, like goons, or maybe goons, bridge, the really strong gainers, maybe trashers. So there are some applications. It has its uses, but overall, I don't think it's very good. I'm actually only going to give this a 3 out of 10. Let's move on to enhance. Enhances costs 3. It says you may trash a non-victory card from your hand to gain a card costing up to 2 more than it. So basically it's like remodel, except you can't remodel green cards. Not being able to remodel green cards hurts a lot. Also, this costs 3 in a buy. I think this is fairly weak, but if there's particularly strong 2s that you want, you can turn coppers into them. Or again, if they're cards that have outlived their usefulness. I think this is the weakest event in this. I'm only going to give it a 2 out of 10. I just think there's usually better things to get. Like if you're turning a silver into a 5, you could have just bought the 5 instead. And I don't think you want, I think you'd rather have the silver than not in most cases. If you're turning a gold into a province, then okay, you could have bought a 6 and that's nice, but it's just not that value that often. That valuable that often. I don't know. Maybe it should be a 3 anyway, and maybe Toil should be a 4 because like events are just so strong anyway. Yeah, Toil's a 4 and Enhance is a 3, but I don't know. I don't think they're that strong. Let's move on to March. March is very interesting. It's a 3-cost event. Look through your discard pile. You may play an action from it. So a couple things to note. An action that I just bought is typically in my discard pile. Occasionally they're not because they go into your hand or on your deck or something, but usually they go into your discard pile. So I can march an action I just bought. That's usually not going to be super useful because it costs 3 in a buy and you're not going to get that back out of very much. But there are a few things. Again, Poor House here. It's likely to make you 4 money, so it might make you a little bit of money, although it's going to cost the buy still in that case. A Wine Merchant. If you were going to have 2 money left over anyway at the end of your turn, say you had another Wine Merchant down, you can buy a Wine Merchant and march it. You get your 3 money back plus 1 more, and you get your buy back. So there's a few things. There's a few things that March will work with there. But the bigger things are you're lower in your shuffle and you want to use the March on something that was higher in your shuffle that you bought last turn or that you already drew or played earlier in the shuffle. So you need to keep in mind what's in your discard pile. You might march some kind of throne room variants in some cases. You might march a gainer to, if I have a workshop in my discard, I march the workshop. It costs me 3 to gain a card that normally costs 4. That's something to watch out for. Travelers, I believe it lets me advance my travelers on to the next stage, so it can speed me up there. An early trasher, so turn 1, I buy a steward. Turn 2, I can march the steward and trash 2 cards. That's good. Ambassadors, probably even better. You could do it with Chapel, although that's not really better than the steward case. So there's a lot of early, usually I think you want to be doing it with more than one thing. More than one card for it to be worth marching, but maybe it's kind of close. There's also a few other cards that there's particular synergy with. So Hermit, I think, is a big one. I play a Hermit, and I want to get a Madman. So I gain another Hermit. And now I have 6 and 2 buys, or, just however much money in buys. I can spend all of them marching the Hermit, which always gains another Hermit, all the way down. So if I play a Hermit to gain a Hermit, and then march the Hermit that I gained and gain another Hermit, I end up basically I've spent 3 money and a buy to gain a Madman. If I have 6 money and 2 buys, I can do that twice, and I've spent 3 money and a buy to gain a Madman twice. This is very, very strong synergy. I can also trash something each of those cases if there's things I want to trash in my hand or discard. So Hermit is a particularly strong synergy with this. There's also Rebuild. Rebuild has this nice way of putting other rebuilds into your discard pile fairly often, or just putting actions in general, but often rebuilds. And very often it's worth 3 or 4 money to play a rebuild is better than a card you would buy in a rebuild deck. So also, the other thing with rebuild is you often trigger shuffles to where I played a rebuild last turn and now it's in my discard pile because it triggered a shuffle. So that's something to watch out for. And then Tactician, right? You can play your treasures and then march a Tactician. So there's some synergy there to think about. It's not as strong as some cases, but it's a way to play with Tactician and treasures in some cases. You had to have you had to have the Tactician in your discard pile, so that's not always the easiest. And then like the ones you draw, then clunk up your hand. So watch out for that. But there are a number of synergies here. But I think most often it's not going to be that useful. So overall, what do I give it? This is part of why ratings are hard. I think I'm going to give it a 5, maybe a 6. I think I'm going to give it a 5 out of 10. Transport. Transport is a 3-cost event. It says choose one, exile an action card from the supply, or put an action card you have in exile onto your deck. So it top decks it. First of all, this lets you on a 3/4 or 4/3 top deck any action in the supply on top of your deck at the start of turn 3. That is already pretty good, right? Very often you would be happy to open with a 5-cost, especially if you get a guarantee that you top deck it. You could do that on 3/4 or 4/3 with Transport. So that's one thing. Besides that, I think often, okay, there's some things that are expensive that just spending 6 and 2 buys is effectively cheaper than buying them. So some things that cost like 8 or 8 debt, or some things that cost 7 or more. They have to be actions, of course. So that's another use of Transport. I think possibly the low-key biggest thing, though, is just getting extra copies of cards that cost more than 3. So I want to get a bunch of labs. I have 11 and 3 buys. I can transport a lab to exile to, and then buy a lab. And I've gained 3 labs. Well, I've gained 1, but I've obtained 3 labs for 11 and 3 buys instead of 15 and 3 buys. It makes them all cheaper, basically, right? Note that it doesn't work very well where cards that have on-gain benefits are the thing. So it doesn't really work very well with your lackeys or your skulks or your border villages. So keep that in mind. But I think making 4 and especially 5 and sometimes 6 costs, 7 costs cheaper is going to be a big deal for Transport. I think this is very strong. I'm going to give it a 9 out of 10. Let's move on to Banish. Banish says it's a 4-cost event. It says exile any number of cards with the same name from your hand. So they have to have the same name as each other. I think the biggest use of this is going to be to exile your estates. You can exile coppers with it, but you have to have so much money. Like you have to have 4 money plus all the coppers in your hand to exile them. And sometimes you're going to want to do that, but it's not a very efficient way to do it. You'd rather trash them. The estates, just being able to get rid of 1 or 2 at a time, though, can be a big deal, especially early on. So, like if you open Banish 1 estate and silver, you're guaranteed to hit 5 on turns 3 and 4, because you have 9 money in your deck and you have 10 cards. So you have to hit 5 at least on one of those turns. And then you can banishing your other estates helps you get more money like fairly quickly after that. Also, you get to keep the points from the estates. If there's strong trashing, I think that's gonna kind of obsolete this a lot, because you just trash the stuff instead. but it can get you up and running fast, or if the trashing is not all that strong. Later on, you can banish, say, provinces, but if you're like drawing your deck and getting multiple provinces a turn, I'm not sure that this is that worth it. Although, if let's say you banish 2 provinces, that's like 1 fewer smithy you need to play. So, and it's better to have 2 fewer provinces in your deck than need to play 2 smithies. So I think banishing 1 or 2 green cards is something that might come up later in the game reasonably often, but not a ton. Again, you still score the points, so that's a nice thing. Yeah, banishing more than 2 provinces, I think, like, by that point, why aren't you ending the game? So I don't think that's going to come up that much. Money decks, getting rid of 1 dead card, like an estate or a province, is typically not on turn 1 or 2, but very quickly becomes better than adding, like, say, a silver to your deck. And if you can ever banish 2, that's like as good or better than adding a gold to your deck pretty quickly. So I think it's actually going to be a pretty common play to fairly quickly banish any of those kinds of cards from your deck pretty frequently when you can, although it's not that much value over getting, say, a decent 4 cost or 5 cost action for your deck. So it's not that great for those situations. I think it's usually going to be better than March, but the upside is probably a lot lower. I'm going to give it a 6 out of 10. Also note that if you exile states, they'll still count negative points against you, so watch out for that. But let's move on to Bargain. Bargain is a 4-cost event. It says gain a non-victory card costing up to 5. Each other player gains a horse. So giving your opponent a horse is something you don't want to do, but gaining a 5 is something you do want to do. So mostly this is going to be used to gain a 5-cost card, where you only have 4 money. In the opening, a lot of 5s are worth, I think, giving your opponent a horse, although it depends, how good is the 4 and how good is the 5. But I think it's often going to be worth it. Later in the game, it probably isn't going to be worth it that much, but if your opponent is drawing their deck pretty reliably anyway, then it couldn't just make 5s cheap for you. And like, okay, so they have 3 extra horses. They're more reliable. Say I do it 3 times on a turn. They're more reliable, obviously, because they have 3 extra horses. But it's not that often that they're going to get to keep all those horses around. They're going to have to play 1 to 2 of them pretty often. And so, okay, it is a cost. It's a real cost, but maybe getting the extra 5s is, well, better. And they're not really doing more with their turn if they were drawing their deck anyway. Now, if it lets them draw their deck, then you maybe don't want to do this as much, but they probably shouldn't really build in a way that assumes that you're going to keep giving them these horses turn after turn. If they do, then stop doing that. But like, you doing it some isn't going to let them count on it later. So I think it's a pretty powerful effect in those situations as well. Giving them reliability can often be worth it to get 5s instead of 4s, but obviously it depends. The other thing is there are a number of situations where this can get around some restriction, where you might even gain something that costs less than 5 with this. So there's mission, contraband, swamp hag, tax, embargo, exploration, maybe giving them the horses bad because of wall or something. There's some small edge cases, and I've probably missed a couple of them as well, but there's some cases that come up. But mission seems to be a big one to me, right? You still get to basically buy cards on your mission turn because, well, you bargain for them instead, but it works out. This seems pretty good to me. Not a world beater because you don't want to give them too many horses, but I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10. Invest. It's 4-cost event. Exile an action from the supply while it's in exile. When another player gains or invests a copy of it plus 2 cards. Oh, I should have noted earlier on transport. If you open silver, which I guess you probably won't usually do on transport boards, but if you do, then by transporting, if you hit 3 or 4 on turn 3, transporting a 5 cost, you get up to 43.4% to get double 5 on turns 3 and 4. So keep that in mind. Invest, you could do a similar thing, but you need to hit 4, and when you hit 4, you're only 29.9% to be able to hit 5-5. That's also including the chances that you hit 5 on both turns naturally, which is about 15% of those chances. So the ability to invest almost doubles that. Did I read invest? I'm going to read it again. Exile an action card from the supply while it's in exile. When another player gains or invests a copy of it, plus 2 cards. So you need to keep track of which cards in exile you invested versus which ones you didn't and are in exile from other reasons. This seems very strong to me. There's 2 things of this. One, it's kind of just like the first half of transport, where you're exiling something and gaining them for cheaper. It's obviously worse than transport at that because it costs 4 instead of 3. But it also has this benefit where when your opponent gains copies of the things, you get to draw 2 cards. I don't know how strong that is. It seems to be pretty good early on. If you can invest in something that your opponents really need to get, then you could draw 2 cards. You can invest more than once in the same thing. And until you take those cards out of exile, you're going to draw, and if you have 2 of them on invested, you're going to draw 4 cards every time they get a thing. And obviously that could be a lot of cards. And for cards that they would want to get a lot of, that can be very, very good. Having said that, once you're drawing your deck, drawing extra cards is only increasing your reliability. So it's not as good as it might be. And, well, sometimes they can play around it by just not gaining the thing. You don't want to get this too early if they can gain the thing later instead. Because when you invest, it's not doing anything for you until either they gain a copy of the card or you gain a copy of the card. So just keep all those things in mind. But I still think it's very strong in general, and I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10. Next we have Seize the Day. Seize the Day says once, it costs 4. It says once per game, take an extra turn after this one. Unlike Mission, you can buy cards on that turn. This is very strong and you should almost always take it. If both players take it, well, basically, it's the same. You've each taken the same number of turns. The order you've taken the turns might change a little bit, but you've taken the same number of turns anyway, right? As long as you get this before the end of the game, it mostly doesn't matter. Now, when you take it, how it does matter is there's 2 ways. One, piles can empty. So if a pile empties, then obviously I can't do something on a later turn once the pile is empty that I could have done on the early turn. I can't gain cards from that pile. If it's a junk pile, I can't junk my opponent with cards from that pile. So in a junking game, you probably want to do this before the junk runs out in an effort to give them more junk, win the junk split, win the curse split, that kind of thing. Otherwise, when do you want to seize the day? Well, it's typically going to be when the amount of money for and a buy costs you the least. I think that's roughly going to be usually around when you'd start greening, but you want to make sure that you get this before the game is over, because if you both get this, it just changes the order of the turns, and that's not a big deal. But if you're the only one to get this, then you've gotten a full extra turn. It might seem like you want to take a turn, the quality of the turn matters, but it doesn't really. Does this advantage some deck versus a different deck? Not really. Because if you each get this, you each have an extra turn, you each have the same number of turns in the game, right? Instead of both of us having 13 turns, we each had 14 turns, even though the current turn counter says is turn 13. So if it was going to be a 14 turn game, now it's a quote unquote 13 turn game. With the only thing again to mention is that it's not a full turn extra because you did have to spend 4 money in a buy buying this. And so the kind of decks that this will help more is the decks where there is a point in the game where 4 money in a buy doesn't matter that much. But I don't think that there are many decks that that's really true for. That it makes a huge difference for, I guess. I guess if you're building very large, then 4 money in a buy at some point is not a significant part of a turn. But if you were trying to race that with like money anyway, you're probably hitting some turn where you like mid-late where you don't have that much money and you just seize the day to basically skip a bad turn. But it's probably a little bit better if you're building more, but I don't think it affects that much. I guess I'm going to give this a 9 out of 10. You should basically always be getting it at some point in the game, but I don't know that it has a huge impact unless you are building very big. Then if you skipped it, it would be bad times for you, probably. I don't know. Oh, and the point about making sure you get it off is making sure they can't end the game, which has a lot to do with pile outs. So just be careful about that. Let's move on to commerce. Commerce costs 5. It says gain a gold per differently named card you've gained this turn. This compares a bit to Windfall. I think it's a bit worse than Windfall because it's hard to gain. It's harder to gain 3 different named cards that you actually want to gain and then still have the 5 and a buy left over for commerce than it is to draw your whole deck and get the Windfall first. Now you can go bigger if you get 4 different named cards and then commerce, or 5, and you can sometimes commerce when you haven't drawn your whole deck, so that's upsides over Windfall. And you can modulate how many golds you gain sometimes by the order you get the commerce in, but usually you're going to want as many as you can get, usually. I don't think this is that great, but it's not going to be that rare that like it's 5 for 2 golds, which is a fine thing to take. It's just not like wowing me that much. I'm going to give it a 4 out of 10. Demand. Gain a horse. It's a 5 cost event. Gain a horse and a card costing up to 4, both onto your deck. So this is basically pretty strong if you wanted the cheaper card anyway. Gaining a horse isn't going to make me very often want a cheaper card than a more expensive card, but it sometimes will if the cards were close. Getting them on top of my deck does help a bit, but again, I think it's not going to make that big of a difference overall. But the big thing here is that so in general I think it's just fairly strong. A couple of things to note though. Let's say you would be gaining a card like, I don't know, a victory card. You're getting a Gardens. That's the card that you would be gaining. Would you demand for it or not? Because you're sticking these Gardens on top of your deck. You don't want it on top of your deck. You would rather have, not it on top of your deck. But the thing is, getting the horse on top of your deck, it's better than just buying the card anyway, right? Having a horse and having it on top of your deck, and let me explain why. If you would not have demanded and just bought your Gardens, then you would have a 5-card hand of A, B, C, D, and E, right? So that's your 5-card hand, and you just play a turn as normal. If you demand for a Gardens, now you have a 5-card hand of horse, Gardens, A, B, and C. Well, after you play your horse, you're going to have a hand of Gardens, A, B, C, D, and E. So you have the same hand as before, except the Gardens is in hand. And if you had any chance of triggering a shuffle, then it's better to have the gardens in hand, or whatever the stop card is. The only difference is if you actively don't want that card in your hand and would rather have it in your deck than in your hand. Or maybe some stuff where your opponent is messing with your hand. Some of those attacks might change things a little bit. Or again, oh, I'm playing with wall. I need to not have the horse in my deck. Sure, although gardens is maybe not the best example in that case. With cost reduction, you can demand a province if you can get them down to costing 4 or more, because it doesn't have any restrictions except for buy cost. Anyway, this is strong. I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10. Stampede costs 5. It says if you have 5 or fewer cards in play, gain 5 horses onto your deck. Yeah, this is, well, how hard is it to have 5 or fewer cards in play? If you're trying to build very big, it's pretty hard because you usually need to play more than that to draw everything or to do stuff. But just from money, if you have if you're just playing treasures, anytime you have 5 or fewer cards in play. Or often you can play a small number of payload cards and get this. The problem is gaining 5 horses on top of your deck and spending 5 and a buy on that is usually not as good as whatever else you could be doing to get 5 or buy on. There's some definite cases for this, though. So first of all, let's say it's turn 3, and I hit 5. I stampede. I'm now going to draw almost all of my deck. I'm going to make sure any of my opening buys that might have missed the shuffle on turn 4 won't. I'm going to have as many bet cards on top of my deck after turn 4 as I did by playing all the horses as not. I can, I suppose, choose to not play some of the horses if that seems worthwhile to me, and I'm still going to be able to buy my 5 cost on turn 4. Having said that, I don't have any chance to get 2 5 costs, so I'm not even sure I would normally do it then. But say one of the things I opened was Chapel. Like, sure, I'm going to be able to Chapel, and I'll probably be able to Chapel away worse cards, and it's fine in those cases. In some of the early cases, if I open with it on turn 1, I'm going to on turn 2 hit 6 or 7. If I was just getting a 5 anyway, then it really didn't matter, because I could have just bought the 5 to start with, which is, I think, often what you're going to want to do. So there's all that stuff. I think late in the game, particularly if I'm playing a money deck, but sometimes even if I'm not, and I just have a dud hand otherwise, it's going to be an excellent buy to give me a shot in the arm of extra draw to help me close out the game. And again, you don't have to play all the horses, although since they're all on top of your deck, you're pretty much going to need to play some of them. Obviously, if there's some reason why gaining 5 horses or 5 cards is really good, I don't know, I have a trader in my hand and I want to gain 5 silvers. Well, it's really good then. What else is there to say? I don't know. I think that endgame scenario is going to be the most common. I think this is a pretty weak event, but it has enough places that I will give it up to 4 out of 10. Next, we move up to a 7 cost event, which is Reap. Gain a gold, set it aside. If you do, at the start of your next turn, play it. Well, anytime you would be buying gold and have 7 and, the money to spare, this is basically better. Because you get the money at the start of your next turn. I think for the most part, you're just going to use this in money decks where hitting 7 used to be pretty bad. This is a pretty good thing to get on 7. Even early on in money decks when you hit 8, early on enough, and depending on where you are in a shuffle, reaping is going to be pretty strong, I think, because then you're very likely to hit like 7 again next turn and you can reap again and just continue to get golds and then, province, and then anytime you hit 7 instead of 8, you can reap and probably hit province the next turn. So it's pretty strong in those cases, because like gold is a good card for money decks, and then having the 3 extra money on top of your 5 card hand is really nice. Having said that, does it actually make you go money appreciably more often? I think somewhat more often, but not. It's not like a sea change. It's a few percent more often, maybe, or ups money's win rate a few percent, but not not a ton, probably. If you hit 7 early enough and can just start chaining these super early, then maybe that's really good for your money deck. Otherwise, like, it's kind of nice for Storyteller, I guess. Helps you draw more then. I don't know. If you're getting the gold anyway, you're gonna reap, but otherwise you're not so much. I gotta give this a 4 out of 10. I think it is like quite useful in the money decks, but pretty unuseful otherwise. Let's move on to Enclave. Enclave costs 8, and it says gain a gold, exile a duchy from the supply. So exiling a duchy from the supply is similar to getting 3 VP chips. You can get the duchy back by gaining one later and discarding it, but you will very rarely want to discard it. You just want to keep it in exile. And you never have to take it out of exile. And then gaining a gold is kind of nice in some cases. 8 is expensive enough that, again, I think you're going to get this in money decks if you hit 8 early enough. The first time to 2 times you hit 8, probably in a money deck, you're going to get Enclave. Depending, you obviously have to watch out for game scenarios and such. But, gold versus provinces early on, a fairly close call anyway. And, yeah. Getting a gold that comes with 3 points is pretty nice. For decks that are building more, scoring some points that don't stay in your deck is nice, although getting the gold does stay in your deck, so you're not really fewer stop cards than buying the duchy. It costs more money, but getting the gold might be nice. I think getting treasures for payload is underrated, so it's something you can do there, but I don't think it's a huge game changer in terms of what style of deck you want to play. But it's something you should probably be getting in most of your games, I would say. I'm going to give it a 6 out of 10. Alliance costs 10. It says gain a province, a duchy, and a state, a gold, a silver, and a copper. Those have to happen in that order. Also demand, you have to get the horse before the other thing in case that matters. But okay, gain a province, a duchy, and a state, a gold, a silver, and a copper. So that's 6 cards. For money density, they have a money density of 1, which may or may not be more useful than getting a province to you. The extra points, though, for deck-wise, the extra points probably means that Alliance, if you're playing a money deck, is basically always better than not. And if you have deck control, the ability to score more points at once is often pretty good, I think. Although it can clog your deck up, so you want to have some plan of dealing with the extra stuff, or to have it be late in the game where you just really need the extra 4 points compared to buying province. Yeah, I think this is pretty good. Similar-ish to Enclave, probably a bit better. 6 or 7. I think I'm going to go 6 out of 10, but I do think it's a little bit better than Enclave. Populate. Gain 1 card from each action supply pile. So note on this, it doesn't have to, it's only action supply piles, but it's every action supply pile. And action supply piles doesn't mean piles that the top card is an action card. So, like, if castles are out there, it's not an action supply pile, even if the top castle is an action supply pile. And if Gladiator Fortune is out there, and fortunes are uncovered, this will gain you a fortune. So keep that in mind, because the Gladiator Fortune pile is an action supply pile, even if there isn't an action on top right now. The strength of this will vary greatly depending on what action piles there are. Obviously, if there's none, it's terrible, or if there's very, very few, it can be pretty bad. If there's a lot, it can be good, but you need the big thing you need to watch out for is, well, if there's some actively bad cards for your deck, and the big thing there is terminal space. Could also be that it adds too many stop cards, but more often it's going to add too many terminals and not enough villages, in which case it might be bad. Watch out also for Death Cart, because Well, first of all, ruins are an action supply pile, so you're going to gain a ruin, and then you're going to gain a death cart, which is going to give you 2 more ruins. That is a lot of junk that you're adding to your deck. Um, but in general, also trash for benefit tends to help because probably some of those actions you didn't want, being able to trash them for benefit is good. So like recruiter is one of the best things for this. Um, yeah, it can be very, very strong though, because right, all of the actions probably cost a lot more than 10 and a lot more than one buy. So if the just the blanket of all actions on a board is a good mix, which like the median board or the average board has that, although there's a lot of variation, then it's going to be very, very good on that board probably. But it depends a lot. Overall, I'm going to give this an 8 out of 10, but it's going to vary wildly from 0 to 10 out of 10. So I think on average, it's going to be like a 7 or an 8, but most often it's going to be like an, I mean, on average, it might be a 7, but most often it's probably going to be somewhere in the 8 to 9 range, I think. And I guess I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10. I don't know. Ratings suck. Okay, let's move on to the cards. Good lord, this is taking forever. Okay, the cards. We've got Black Cat. Black Cat is a 2-cost action attack reaction card. It says +2 cards. If it isn't your turn, each other player gains a curse. Okay. Then it's got the reaction part that says when another player gains a victory card, you may play this from your hand. So that's usually going to happen on your opponent's turn. So then when you react this, you play this, they all gain a curse. Note that if you played a card on your opponent's turn, it gets discarded at the end of their cleanup, unless it's a duration and would stay out. So, right, if my opponent buys a province and then I react this at their cleanup stage, this will get discarded, so I can draw it again on my next turn. So keep that in mind. There are situations if you can build with a ton of these, like you get 5 or 6 of them, your deck's fairly thin. There's no way to curse otherwise. This can be very strong in terms of your opponent might not want to take green cards because they're going to take a lot of curses potentially, because you can keep chaining these, right? You don't have to have them all in your hand when they gain the green card. If you react the first one, that draws you 2 more cards, and if one of those was a Black Cat, you can react that to the same greening event. So keep that in mind. The top of also you can react it even if it isn't your turn, even if it is your turn, like you ambassador them to estates, or you played a governor to remodel gold into province and they remodeled a 4-cost into a duchy or something. It's your turn, you can react it. They won't gain a curse if it's your turn, but you can still react it to draw the cards. And it doesn't take an action play if you're playing it using the reaction bit, right? So keep that in mind. So the attack is pretty strong and annoying, but a lot of times there's going to be ways kind of around it. Like you don't want to get too many of these too early because the top effect is kind of weak. So there's that. You need a lot of villages to support them unless you're reacting them, which you're probably not doing often. So that's the main reason I don't think it's going to be super strong. It's terminal. If there's other cursing, the curses are probably going to run out before this ever gets to deal many or any out. If there's strong enough trashing, they can maybe just deal with it with trashing, or if there's watchtower, or if there's traitor or something that they can defend themselves with. There's that. This is 3 types for courtier. It's an attack for all of the things that react to being attacked. Anyway, yeah, it's pretty decent in the situations where your opponent really needs to play around it a lot. But I guess the other thing is they might also be able to just do like all their greening at once and end the game, maybe on a pile out. And at that point, like, yeah, you're giving them a few curses, but it might not matter. It can be very strong in the situations where it's a big threat to give them a lot of curses, but otherwise it's quite weak. Overall, I'm going to give it a 4 out of 10. Slay, 2-cost action reaction, gain 2 horses. So there are a lot of cards, a lot. There's 3 cards I think in the set that have this text of gain 2 horses. Let's analyze what that means a bit before we look at the reaction part underneath. So terminal, gain 2 horses. It costs me a card. I have to draw this, and I have to draw each of the 2 horses, so I have to draw 3 cards, and then playing the 2 horses, I get 4 back. So effectively, it's a terminal, because terminal space, it costs me 1, because this is terminal and the horses aren't. It's a terminal, and it increases my hand size by 1, but it doesn't increase my hand size the first time I play it, because I then still have to draw the horses. And now is more important than later. But on the flip side, the actual draw parts can't draw anything dead. So overall, it draws on the order of Moat, but I think it draws a little bit better than Moat overall, because I think it draws a little bit better than Moat overall because it can't do the draw dead stuff. Although getting the draw later, I don't know, it's kind of close to Moat in terms of draw level, which is not particularly strong, but I think other people underrate that a little bit. It's okay. This also has a reaction on it. So the reaction on Slay is when you gain a card, you may discard this to put that card into your hand or onto your deck. This is not an effect that you should get Slay for, particularly, really. But it does help if you have too many terminals too early in the turn. The end of the hand is the big thing. Note that because you have to discard this to react, you only got to do it once, and then you have to draw it again. You could do it multiple times in a turn if you discard it and then redraw it and then discard it in the same turn, but you can only do it once per... Well, you have to redraw it again, basically. That's the deal, right? I mean, this can maybe save your turn by... you have some kind of a workshop or another Slay that gains a horse or something, gains a draw card, gains a non-terminal, gains a village. And that can save your turn. If you had terminal collision, you got to top deck the thing that you buy, which is a little something. But overall, I think this card's pretty weak. I'm going to give it a 3 out of 10. Supplies. It's a 2-cost treasure. It gives you a money, and then when you play it, gain a horse onto your deck. So this is, again, it's like a peddler because you have to draw this and the horse. That's 2 cards you have to draw. The horse gives you 2 cards back. You're even. You don't draw anything the first time that you draw this. You will draw everything. You will draw like the next turn because it top decks. But the first turn you draw this, it's just a copper, which is pretty bad, especially because early turns tend to be better than later turns. But having the effect of a peddler and having slightly more consistent, reliable hands because the horses come at the start of a turn, those are both nice effects. So I think this is a pretty good card, but probably not something you want to open with very often. Let's check the stats on that. Opening supplies makes you only 59% to hit 5 on turn 3 or 4. You're 6.8% to hit 6. That's a lot worse than silver. Now supplies silver is 81.7% to hit 5. That's a little more than 10% lower than hitting 5 with silver. You're 5.2% to hit 5 twice. Again, that's about a 10% hit that you're taking. 26.5% to hit 6. It's about a 15% hit you're taking. And 1.9% to hit 7. That's like a 6 or 7% hit you're taking. So, okay. You might want to open silver supplies or some other economic card supplies some of the time. Reasonably often, you might want to open silver anyway and then get the supplies later. You probably don't want to open supplies very often because like if you're happy on taking cheaper cards, you probably would get those cheaper cards other than supplies. And if you want to have a 5 or something more expensive, you probably want at least one card that's not a supplies. But pretty soon, I think they get to be better than silvers and quite decent cards for most decks that but they're not world beaters by any means. I'm going to give them a 6 out of 10. Next, let's move on to Camel Train. Camel Train is a 3-cost action. It says exile a non-victory card from the supply. And then there's a horizontal line. It says when you gain this, exile a gold from the supply. So this compares vaguely to duplicate. Duplicate, like duplicate, you have to gain another copy of the card to be able to gain the one that you're duplicating, or in this case, Camel Training. Camel Train lets you claim the card earlier. So like with Knights or something, you can claim the card. It works actually much better with Knights than Duplicate does. But, with, say there's an obelisk pile, right? You can Camel Train the obelisk card and it scores you points immediately. So that's something that is better than duplicate. It's cheaper than duplicate. It doesn't go to your tavern mat, which is probably slightly worse than the duplicate case, although there's upsides and downsides. You don't have to draw it again like you do with duplicate, but you do have to choose a little bit earlier what card you want, because you have to exile it when you play this as opposed to when you gain the other card. But it's very similar to duplicate overall. I do want to comment on a bit of math around this. So with Camel Train, you might think, well, let's say I'm playing money. If I get this turn, do I get this on turn 3? And, well, if you hit 5, you should probably just get a 5. If you hit 3 or 4, though, maybe you could think about what are my chances of hitting a gold next turn, and I have this golden exile, and I can get 2, which would be very good, right? As opposed to getting silver and then the gold. I'd rather have 2 golds and a Camel Train, probably. So if you have copper, 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 estate, estate on turn 3, then your 4th, 7th to hit a gold in your next turn, 57%. If you hit copper, silver, estate, 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 which is a lot less likely, but possible, then your 5/7 are 71% to hit gold on turn 4. If you have 4 coppers in an estate, you're only a third to hit gold on turn 4. If you have silver, copper, copper, estate, estate, you're 23.8% to hit gold on turn 4. So I wouldn't actually recommend getting the Camel Train for those purposes very often. But, I mean, you're going to hit gold at some point, and maybe the Camel Train is kind of useful. I guess the biggest difference between Camel Train and Duplicate is probably that you can duplicate things like duchies. You can't do that for Camel Train. But you can get a lot of expensive things kind of cheaper, so it's a card that you're going to get reasonably often. I think just not in large quantities all that much. It's like a 3, or I'm going to give it, I think, a 4 out of 10. Goat Herd. Goat Herd is a 3-cost action. It says plus an action, you may trash a card from your hand, plus 1 card. Per card, the player to your right trashed on their last turn. So note that you have to do the things in order. You have to trash before you draw. I think you're not going to draw very many cards with these very often. Either your opponent's going to do a lot of trashing soon, in which case you're going to get some big burst to draw from this, after which point it doesn't draw much, or you're going to draw a card or 2 from this like semi-often. It really depends on how much trashing your opponents do. If your opponent isn't trashing at all, then this is like a forager that never makes you money or gives a buy, which is pretty bad. Like you would take that sometimes, but you'd skip trashing pretty often in that case. If your opponent, if Goat Herd is the only trashing on the board, your opponent gets it, I think you skipping it might well be the way to go. Although their Goat Herds make yours a little better, blah, blah, blah. I don't know. I mean, it depends a lot on what else is going on, but, if there's trashers like upgrade or junk dealer or sentry or something, then this is after you get those. This turns into some reasonable facsimile of them, but it's still not that great. I think it shines most probably where trash for benefit is a key part of what's going on. You know, you're remodeling something, uh, moneylender to some extent, um, but you're remodeling something or you're butchering things or you're apprenticing things for your draw. Then this card might draw a lot in those cases, and then it can be very good. Um, Overall, though, I think it's actually one of the weaker cards in the set. I'm only going to give it a 3 out of 10. Scrap is a 3-cost action. It says trash a card from your hand, choose a different thing per 1 cost that it costs. And the different things that you're getting are plus a card, plus an action, plus a buy, plus a money, gain a silver, and gain a horse. So, okay, if you're opening scrap silver and trying to line this up with an estate, which I think would be the most reasonable thing to do with this, you're 84.4% to hit 5 if you sell out completely to hit 5 and, you know, take card and money every time. You're 6.8% to hit it twice. You're 24% to hit 6 or more. You have the same chance of it missing your estates as you do with Salvager or Remodel or any of that stuff. The benefits you're getting, I'm getting lower on this over time. I think you're usually going to have some other trashing that you're going to appreciate more. And if this is the only way to trash estates, I guess you probably take it most often, but it's not a sure thing. Even it's just not that good, because like the benefit that you're getting out of it is just not that good usually. If it's the only plus buy, it's the only plus buy. You'll go for it. If it's yeah, there's a couple of weird things you can do with it. If you have a lot of them and you've mostly drawn your deck, you can trash a silver to take plus a card plus an action and a silver, and then trash another silver from your hand to take plus a card plus an action plus a silver, and just like loop that a lot. You can do the same thing with horse instead of silver. You probably don't want to get a lot of scraps just to do that, but that might be something useful in games with Conquest for the silver, or for Triumph, or the silver might also be good for Guildhall, but in general, it's not really something you want to do. It's just cute. I'm actually pretty low on this card. I'm only going to give it a 3 out of 10, but if it's the only estate trashing, you might pick one up, and if it's the only plus buy, I guess you probably will. Also, like, it's trash for benefit to work with rats, but I don't think I want it most of the time. Let's move on to Sheepdog. Sheepdog is a 3-cost action reaction. It says plus 2 cards. Below the line it says when you gain a card, you may play this from your hand. So if you've bought a card, then that's not very good, because again, you're only going to be able to play, well, more Sheepdogs reacting afterwards, or night cards. You can't play treasures usually at the time. Well, if you've bought this, right? If you're gaining it otherwise, though, say with Horn of Plenty, then you can, you know, play a Horn of Plenty to gain a Horn of Plenty, react this, and then play that Horn of Plenty. So that's pretty nice with workshops or things that can gain mid-turn. Then this turns into a lab because you play this without needing to use an action to play it. You can also react this on your opponent's turn if you're getting a card on your opponent's turn, say via their governor or something. And then you discard it at the end of their turn, and you can replay this again. So that's kind of the best case scenario for this. It's pretty good against governor. Overall, people seem to love this card. I don't think it's that great because you kind of need a gainer for it to be very good at all. And you need to line it up, and it's hard to have a lot of these, and it's only a lab, which is, I mean, it's good. And with gainers, it is good, but I think it's quite situational, and then just plus 2 cards isn't the worst thing ever, but it's not really what I want to be doing for my 3-cost terminal action. Overall, I think I'm going to give this 4 out of 10. Maybe 5. I think I'm going to go as low as... there's probably enough. No, I'm going to stick to my guns. This is still a lukewarm take, not a cold take. I'm going to give it a 4 out of 10. Next is Snowy Village. Snowy Village is a 3-cost action, says +1 card, +4 actions, +1 buy. Ooh. But then ignore any further plus actions you get this turn. So if you play another village after this, that village is now a terminal instead of a village. If you play a cantrip out of this after this, it's not really a cantrip, it's a terminal. So that hurts a lot. You don't want to get like 10 of these, probably. A lot of people think this card is quite good. I have a bit of a struggle in figuring out when I want to add this to my deck. So the thing is, the big use for it would be you're just going to use it to play a lot of terminal payload cards. And you get to play it like at the end of your turn then, and then you're going to play your terminal payload cards, and you get 4 out of it, and that's great. And that is great if you can do that. But first of all, how often is it that you have like 4 terminal payload cards that you want to play? Second of all, you need to not play this earlier in your turn if you have to play a bunch of other cards to draw your deck. If they're cantrips, if they're labs, if they're village and smithy. It's not going to work well if you have to play this early in your turn. So it's almost like a stop card for a lot of your turn. I mean, you can play it, but you're just like limiting your turn, right? The bigger thing is like, oh, it gives +4 actions. It's so good early on because you could add so many terminals. But you don't really, because you need to draw this together with the terminals. If you have a very thin deck, then yes, you can add this early on and add a lot of terminals. But if you don't have a very thin deck, then you still need, if you get a lot of terminals, you're not going to draw this with them a lot, and you're going to get a lot of terminal collisions that don't have a village with them. So that's like pretty bad. I mean, having said all that, 4 actions is a lot of actions, and plus buy, hey, sometimes it's the only plus buy. I think the downsides are very real on this. Oh, I should note about villagers. This stops villagers from converting into giving you extra actions, but you can use villagers at any time in your, not in any action phase, but in your action phase. Which means after you've played this, you can use villagers, but you're not going to get the plus action effect out of them. Pretty bad. But when you play this, even mid-resolution of the card, after you've drawn a card and before the bottom line takes effect, you can use as many villagers as you want right then to be able to tie you over to the rest of for the rest of the turn. So actually this works pretty well with things that give you villagers, because like patron or recruiter, they can continue to give you villagers later in the turn after this, and that isn't prohibited from the restriction on the end of this. Overall, I don't want a lot of this copy. I want one or, I mean, there's also some cases where I want a few of them. Like there was an Ironworks Rush deck that I saw a while back where you just weren't drawing too many cards, but you might have a lot of terminals in it. That is not a situation in a hand. That's not a situation that comes up a lot, but Snowy Village is great there. I'm going to give this a 7 out of 10, I think. It's pretty strong. I prefer to have most other villages in a lot of cases. But, I mean, I'm probably going to get one of this a fair amount. And if it's the only village, I don't know. Let's just move on. Stockpile. Stockpile is a 3-cost treasure. It gives you 3 money and a buy, and when you play it, you exile it. So you can just get another one and get the stockpiles back from exile. And that's going to be something that I think you do. I think this card is very strong. Something that you do in most games. Opening stockpile. Let's get some math here. Opening stockpile gives you a 98.7% chance to hit 5 or more on turns 3 or 4. It gives you a 39.9% chance to hit 5 or more twice. It gives you an 88.4% chance to hit 6 or more, a 12.6% chance to hit 6 or more twice, a 24.7% chance to hit 7 or more, a 47.7% chance to hit 7 or more, a 24.7% chance to hit 8 or more, and a 8.8% chance to hit 9. So like, you know, more than 1 in 12 games, close to 1 in 11 games, you can get a platinum on turn 3 by opening stockpile. Or not on turn 3, on turn 3 or 4, right? Half of those, it's going to be turn 3. That's obviously really good numbers, but the stockpiles are then out of your deck unless you get another one. If you go stockpile silver, then you're 94.9% to hit 5 or more at least once, 27.3% to hit 5 or more twice, 73% to hit 6 or more, 1.3% to hit 6 or more twice, 33.6% to hit 7 or more, and 8.8% to hit 8. Yeah, stockpile, if you want to hit those expensive things, opening double stockpile, actually I think in many, if not most cases, you're going to want to open with at least one and probably two stockpiles. It's going to commit you to getting more stockpiles, and eventually the stockpile pile will run out, at which point your economy can tend to kind of disappear. But okay, so there's a couple of ways of getting around that. If you can trash and regain stockpiles, so that's rogue, grave robber, or treasurer, can regain them from the trash, and any number of ways to trash them. You need something to trash it, and then one of those three things to gain it back. Then you can continually gain them and get them out of exile. But I think even though it's temporary, like, you still want to go after them fairly often. I mean, first of all, it just accelerates you so fast, and that's such a big deal. I think that's probably almost worth it, if not worth it by itself. The plus buy, sometimes it's the only plus buy, or plus buy is scarce. Plus buy also lets you get something cheap and a stockpile to regain them. Or not regain them, but rediscard them out of exile fairly often. You only have to get them back out of exile like once per shuffle, so that's something that as you're playing, you can play for and around. Is to try to do that like closer to the end of a shuffle, maybe, if you're getting other things. But I think the thing is just if one player goes for them and the other doesn't, you get a ton of money and a long-lasting effect out of the stockpiles for the player that did go for them. And if one player goes hard for them and the other player like gets one or two to try to deny, I mean, sometimes when the pile's getting really low, you might want to do some amount of denial to stop your opponent from getting them back, like getting a little bit more than you otherwise would, because they're not that bad to have anyway, right? But you just get so much more benefit out of having so many more than your opponent that I think it's usually worth it and very good. I'm gonna give it an 8 out of 10. Bounty Hunter, similar opening math to stockpile silver, 94.9% to hit 5. I should describe what Bounty Hunter does. Bounty Hunter is a 4-cost action. It gives you +1 action. Exile a card from your hand. If you didn't have a copy of it in exile already, +3 money. So this is a very good opener. Similar opening stats for Bounty Hunter Silver as you got for Stockpile Silver. 94.9% to hit 5 or more. 27.3% to hit 5 or more twice. 73% to hit 6 or more. 1.3% to hit 6 or more twice, 24.7% to hit 7 or more. Actually, I think that's exactly 7. I don't think you can hit more than 7. Yeah, so Bounty Hunter is a very strong opener. It's a pretty strong card overall, I think. You are going to get 1 estate exile, which is going to give you 3 money. You're going to get 1 copper exile, which is going to give you 3 more money. Maybe there's heirlooms, or it's a bit better with, why can't I think of the shelters, because you get more differently named cards, so it's really good then. After you've exiled 1 of each of those things, you're probably going to keep wanting to exile like estates and coppers, and then it's not going to give you any money. But it's accelerated you enough that it's like worth it in that case, usually. And then later on, you can like exile silver and then gain another silver, right? And get some money that way. Or exile a horse and gain another horse. And so that's something that's going to come up and give you some more money. A couple of... the big thing is green cards. So like I green and I get a province, and then I can exile the province to the Bounty Hunter, which one time is going to give me money, which is absolutely fantastic. but also just like it gets the province out of my deck, which is very good. It still scores points for me, but it's out of my deck. Same thing with the duchy, right? So this card is very, very good. Um, I'm between 8 and 9 on it. I think I'm going to give it 8, mostly because if the other thinning is strong enough, then this makes this like only a meh card. Um, but in general, it's very, very strong, and I wouldn't fault anyone for giving it a 9. I don't think it's quite a 10. Let's move on to a Cardinal. Cardinal is a 4-cost action attack, gives you +2 money, and then each other player reveals the top 2 cards of their deck, exiles 1, costing from 3 to 6, and discards the rest. So this is kind of like a night attack, but it goes to exile instead of being trashed. And it only costs 4. I think the difference between exile and trashed is very big because, like, most of the things your opponent can just get it back. And like green cards, you would rather have an exile anyway. But like, if they exile my Smithy, I'm just gonna get another Smithy and get it back anyway. Um, so overall, the attack is pretty weak. Um, there are a few situations though where the attack can be strong. So black market, they're never going to be able to get the thing out of exile except with by transport, because it's in exile and you can't gain another copy of a card from the black market deck. Any piles that have run out, and particularly split piles, so like knights is the big thing here. It exiles the knights, you're never going to get the knight back. Um, but split piles are going to run out faster, and any pile that has run out, it's going to be very hard to get back from Cardinal. So at that point in the game, Cardinal starts to look better, but like you probably don't want to like plan ahead for that and get the Cardinal. I mean, it does something early because it makes the thing miss a shuffle effectively anyway, and maybe makes you gain something that you wouldn't otherwise have. So it's not that the attack does nothing otherwise. Also, I guess the other big thing to note here is Travelers. Travelers are also cards which are hard to normally gain. There are ways that you can trash the Traveler and gain them from the trash, but it's very hard to do normally. So Cardinal can be potent against them in some cases. But in general, it's not a very effective use of your terminal space, so it's pretty weak. I'm actually going to give this a 2 out of 10. I think it's probably the second weakest card in this set. Let's move on to Cavalry. Cavalry is a 4-cost action that says gain 2 horses. So this we saw on Slay already, and we talked about how strong that was. But it has a line, and it says below the line, it says when you gain this, +2 cards, +1 buy, and if it's your buy phase, return to your action phase. So that's reminiscent of Villa. I think this is significantly worse than Villa. Drawing 2 cards is good, it's really good, but it doesn't go into your hand like Villa did, and it doesn't give you an action like Villa did. So you need to have actions to make use out of going into that action phase. Again, actions left over. Or I guess you're drawing treasures that you can then play at the start of your buy phase after you've bought this. But, you know, that's okay. So what are the situations you're using this in? Well, going back to your buy action phase is a powerful effect, and drawing the 2 cards and getting a buyback is nice. Oftentimes, if you're going to want to do this, you want to do it before you've run out of terminals so that you can play on after you've drawn a couple cards. So if you have a terminal in hand, you might buy this and then hope to draw a village or something to save you from a dud, right? You go to your buy phase, you play some treasures, you buy this, right? It doesn't work as well as Villa does with, say, draw to X kind of stuff. It doesn't work nearly as well in those cases, because it draws the cards, right? Obviously. With a gainer and there's no plus buy, this can be a weird way to get you plus buy. But let's say you're trying to do big things where you're doing gain and play. You need to have some pretty significant extra action, plus action, in your deck for this to be worth it. And you probably want to have overdraw. Because if you're wanting to like gain some more payload and then by this and then draw into the payload, then you need to draw the payload. This is always going to be one of the cards that you can draw off of itself. And if you're trying to have more draw to draw significant, like multiple extra payload cards, then you're going to need extra draw in hand, or otherwise you could draw some of those payload cards before this. So it's a little bit tricky to work out, and you need to have like a lot of extra deck control typically to do really big things with this. But if you do, you can do really big things with this. And otherwise it can save you a little bit. And just like that Slay quasi mode effect isn't that bad. And well, if you can effectively make use of drawing the 2 cards on gain on this, it gets rid of the downside. So it does turn into something that's like a bit better than Moat. I still don't think this is busted because I think you need a lot going on before it gets really strong. And while it can be really strong in those cases, I think in the average case it's only okay. So I think I'm going to give this 6, maybe 7 out of 10. No, I'm going to go 6. I'm going to go 6 out of 10. Next is Groom. Groom is a 4-cost action. It says gain a card costing up to 4. If it's an action card, gain a horse. If it's a treasure card, gain a silver. If it's a victory card, then you get +1 card and +1 action. Groom is really, really good in terms of workshop variants, at least ones that are limited to gaining things that cost up to 4. I think I like it better than all of the rest of them except for Inventor. And I'm including, what's the 5-cost one from the previous? Sculptor. Like, I think I like it better than Sculptor even. So, unlike Ironworks, if you're gaining an action, it's terminal. But you usually don't want to play a lot of workshop effects on a turn anyway. And if I want a lot of actions in my deck, such that I'm gaining actions, then having a terminal is usually not that big of a problem. And gaining a horse is pretty nice. Effectively, if I'm gaining an action with this every time I play it, it's like this was a cantrip workshop on average overall in the long term, right? So that's like quite a not a cantrip, but a +1 card because it's still terminal, right? In that case, gaining a silver off of a treasure, silver isn't always that great, but if you were gaining a treasure anyway, probably silver is a good card in your deck, and being able to increase your payload by 2 silvers at a time is pretty significant, right? If we think about Treasure Trove increases your payload by 4. Now, sometimes you're able to trash the copper, and that's part of why Treasure Trove is good. Treasure Trove is also not terminal. But this also gives you 4 money, and you can draw the silvers you gained in the same turn. So this has just the silver mode has some benefits over Treasure Trove, which is that makes it decent for money, and it only costs 4, and that's a decent way to increase your payload as well. So that's actually also pretty strong. And then the ability to cantrip when you need to is also pretty good. The other thing I want to note about Groom though is it's very good in cheap green card rushes. So the 2 main culprits here are Gardens and Silk Road, where in like 13-ish, like I don't know, I think I've seen as fast as 11, but more often 12 to 14. I'm not exactly sure on the number of turns, but somewhere around that number of turns, you can empty the Grooms and the Silk Road or the Gardens piles and the Estates piles. You have like 4-point Gardens or Silk Roads, so you're scoring 43 points and emptying piles quite quickly. It's a very strong combination. You can try to do that with like Island or Tunnel, but it's a little bit I wouldn't recommend as much because you're not going to score near as much, but it's fine, I guess. And then lastly, it can also be a very strong enabler for Fiatdom, but playing that is trickier, and I'm not going to try to get into the details of that now. But it can be a fairly strong enabler there as well. I think it's a bit less good than say the Silk Road or Gardens, but it's still quite strong. I give Groom an 8 out of 10. Hostelry. Hostelry is a 4-cost action plus a card plus 2 actions, so it's a village. And then below a dividing line, it says when you gain this, you may discard any number of treasures revealed to gain that many horses. Yeah. So first of all, it's just a village. Villages are good, and I often pay 4 for village, so fine. No, the gaining horses bit I think is not that strong of an upside. So I'd put this weaker than, I don't know. I feel like what I feel like is most villages, but I guess in my village power rankings, I would probably put it a little bit ahead, but probably a little bit ahead, but on the same order as like Mining Village or Blessed Village, but somewhere in that range. Do note that if you can gain it instead of buy it, then it can sometimes be quite a bit better. So like alms, alms with this, you can open double this and discard all your treasures and get 7 horses, which is a great way to jumpstart your what you have going on. Um, yeah. Besides that, if you were paying 5 for a village anyway, you can discard a copper and get a horse. That's fine, but it's in terms of 5-cost villages. Like I'd rather have a bazaar that gives me money every turn than 1 horse once. So I don't think this is that strong. Although, but I do think it gets better once you're discarding kind of more treasures, to where I'm getting 3 horses or something, right? Because I discarded 3 coppers. You do have to keep the treasures around to be able to get that benefit out of it. They have to be in your hand. But effectively, you're discarding a card now, one of the treasures, to be able to draw a card later with the horse, which is sometimes fine, but not that great. I think, like, late-ish in the game, you might take this, like, right before a shuffle, where it's likely to be your last shuffle, and you're going to buy this and then get a horse or 2 or 3, because then it doesn't really matter that the horse is ephemeral as much. Overall, I mean, it's a village. It can't be that low. I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10. Village Green. Village Green says either now or at the start of your next turn, +1 card, +2 actions. And then it's a 4-cost action duration reaction, and there's a dividing line for the reaction bit. But I want to note, so the printed version says when you discard this other than during cleanup, you may play it. But it is received an errata that says when you discard this other than during cleanup, you may reveal it to play it, which matters if you discard multiple of them at the same time and then you react one of them and draw a card which triggers a shuffle, then you will no longer be able to reveal the other one, so you won't be able to play them anymore. Because they'll be in your deck rather than your discard pile. So keep that in mind. Anyway, the main, like, if you just forget the reaction part of this for a second, a village that you can save for next turn, and then the next turn you're going to start with a 6-card hand and 3 actions in it. That's pretty strong. It gets you a lot of reliability. Yeah, it's a pretty strong effect. It's a pretty good upside for village. It would be kind of in the middle of villages. I don't think it would be as good as something like Port. But this does have the reaction. And I got to tell you, you may not realize it, but there are a lot of cards that let you discard cards. And a lot of them even let you discard multiple cards. Or let you discard cards incidentally. First of all, watch out for anything that like you're looking and reordering the top of your deck, whether it be Scrying Pool, whether it be Cartographer, whether it be the Sun's Gift, all that kind of stuff. You basically always want to discard the Village Green rather than try to draw it this turn, because you get to play it for free, which doesn't cost an action. It gets you basically an extra card drawn and an extra action to play at this turn, right? So that's really, really good. Things can discard from your deck, like Rebuild or certain of your opponent's attacks, Fortune Teller or Rabble, uh, some of the hexes, right? You can react it then. That's really good. um, but then there's just like a lot of cards. There's Storeroom, there's Warehouses, there's Embassy, there's Vault. There's a lot of cards. There's Horse Traders. There's a lot of cards that you might cellar. You might not even realize discard cards, or might not think about that much, but can actively work with this to potentially even produce draw, right? Like enough of these and cellars or warehouses can increase your hand size because you're reacting these and get you a ton of extra terminal space. So this card is very, very good. It's one of the very best villages overall. It has discard synergies on most boards. Library reacts with this. Minion. There's so many things, right? It's very good if you can react it, and it's pretty decent otherwise anyway. I think this is a 9 out of 10. Let's move on to Barge. Barge is a 5 cost action duration, and it says either now or at the start of your next turn, plus 3 cards and plus 1 buy. So, yeah, this is usually going to be something you want to take now, because now is more important than later. But if you're overdrawing your deck, having one of them that you're durationing to give you a big starting hand for reliability on your next turn can also be very useful. The flexibility makes this a pretty decent but not great in terms of your 5 cost smithies. I think it's better than most of them, like better than Rabble, better than Patrol, but maybe around the level of Catacombs or Journeyman. Probably a little bit better because of the plus buy. Plus buy is pretty big. So I'm going to give this a 7 or let's say 8 out of 10. It's a strong card. Note that if you don't duration it, it doesn't stay out. So part of the reason why also it's better to not duration it is you get to play it every turn then. But let's move on to Coven. Coven is a 5 cost action attack, plus an action, plus 2 money, and each other player exiles a curse from the supply. If they can't, they discard their exiled curses. So, yeah, this is a cursing attack that's non-terminal, but the curses don't go into their deck until after the curses have run out and you play this another time. So, a biggest part of what curses do is slow you down in getting your deck going, because they get in the way. They get in the way of drawing cards. They don't make money. They don't do anything for you. And this doesn't have that effect until late. Now, late, it can dump a whole bunch of curses at once, which you might argue is makes them harder to deal with at that point, because you have a lot of them in your deck as opposed to being able to trash them as you go. But I think in general that harder to deal with all at once thing is less of an issue than getting the curses earlier and hurting your deck for longer. So I think this is, weaker. I mean, there's no question. It's weaker than if you would just give them the curse immediately. There are going to be cases where you can build a deck that's strong enough that you just totally skip this, and your opponent's never going to effectively be able to hurt you by getting curses in your deck. Now, they are negative points for you as soon as you exile them, so keep that in mind. But if your deck is fast enough, you might be able to just race the curses coming into your deck. Never touch Coven, and you end up with like 8 or 9 on your mat or something, but it takes a while to play 10 of these. And until they play, actually it's 11, right? Until they play 11, your deck doesn't suffer at all. So, okay, keep that in mind. Another thing is, I guess you can buy a curse to get these into your discard earlier. You really usually wouldn't want to do that, but maybe you have some way to trash them all at once right now that maybe you wouldn't be able to later. So, like, I don't know, buy a curse, discard them all, doctor overpay for 10. I've drawn my deck, I trash all the curses. That's not really going to come up much. Um, I don't think you can usually skip, like I talked about, you can skip Covens sometimes. You can skip it more often than other curses, I think, but I think you still usually are going to want to play with it at some point. But it's less of a get it right now than some of the other cursors. I think where you really don't want to end up is you've played it like 2 or 3 times, and your opponent has played it 7 or 8, and you end up with a lot more curses than them, and they come into your deck. You want to avoid that. But you might be able to, say, build some more of your other deck control first and then get this later on, and then you're going to play the Coven more often than the person who played it sooner, and so you catch up in Coven plays to some extent as well. But the reason I don't think you can skip it that much is because so it lowers a pile and it's negative points against you, and it's like fairly likely that piles can run out if you are doing something that's uh, semi quick, that another pile could be running out, and so then you may be jockeying for position in a pile ending, and then the Coven helps you. It gives you pile control and gives them negative points. Um, so I think you usually are going to want to get Coven, but I think it is noticeably worse than most of the other cursing attacks, despite being non-terminal. I'm going to give it a 7, 8, 7 out of 10, I think. Displace. Displace is a 5-cost action. Exile a card from your hand. Gain a differently named card costing up to 2 more than it. Okay. It has to be differently named, so you can't displace province in a province, which would be busted. But you can displace province without losing the points from province, and you can get probably anything on the board. So that's pretty nice. I know a lot of people are really high on this. I think it requires quite a bit of deck control, at which point it's often one of the better bits of payload on the board, but not like top tier payload like Goons or Bridge, I don't think. And it requires, I don't know, quite a bit to actually get there, and you need to have an expensive card to be able to displace at the beginning, and then getting them back out of, getting the gold, say, back out of exile as you're going province into gold and gold into province. Like, it's not the easiest thing to weave. You need to have enough plus action, enough draw. I mean, overall, I think this is pretty strong, but it's not amazing. It's a 6 or a 7. I'm going to go with a 7, I think, on this as well. Falconer is an action reaction 5 cost. Gain a card cost to your hand costing less than this. And then the reaction bit says, when any player gains a card with 2 or more types, you may play this from your hand. So things to watch out for type-wise are things that have multiple colors, attacks, ruins have the ruins type. Anything that gives you boons or hexes, I believe, have types that go along with that. Death Cart is a looter. That's a type. Tells you to keep the ruins out. So watch out for those things with multiple types. I mean, really, just read the card. It will all say multiple. They'll all say multiple types on it. Except, commands. So commands have been errated to be commands now. They used to be shapeshifters. So like Overlord has 2 types now. So keep that in mind. Yeah, if you can react this, then it's like it's plus an action. Otherwise, it compares pretty well to not pretty well, but it compares most closely to Sculptor, where it seems to be worse because you can't get the villagers, although you can react this maybe. You can't get the villagers, and it doesn't have cost reduction shenanigans, both of which help Sculptor a lot, I think. However, Sculptor's pretty strong, so this is all should still probably be okay at least. You need to have enough village support to be able to react this reliably. I think it's 5 or 6. 5 or 6. I guess I'm going to go with 6 out of 10. Next is Gatekeeper. Gatekeeper is a 5-cost action duration attack. Note that it's an action duration attack because I think that's the strongest thing of this card. This card is terrible. Let me read what it does. At the start of your next turn, +3 money. Until then, when another player gains an action or treasure card they don't have an exiled copy of, they exile it. Okay, so this can slow them down on getting things if they're only getting one thing. But like if you open with this on a 5-2, you could have just opened with the 5 you're trying to stop them from getting the copy of, and you would be further ahead. And that's true on almost every case. The attack part of this is just so weak. They're getting multiple cards. They could just get multiple copies of the thing, and it didn't hurt them at all. Or multiple copies of the thing over 2 turns, and they just didn't have it for a turn. It's just such a weak attack. I mean, not that it does nothing, but it's not very strong for being a terminal card that you would need to get 2 of to be able to attack them every turn. And it only gives you 3 money on the second turn. That's an attack, or that's a benefit to you that's as weak as Swamp Hag, which has a much stronger attack, or Raider, which is a very weak card and not a terminal action. And yeah, it costs 6, but it has an attack that I think might even be about as strong as this. So I think this card is very bad, and you should get it very rarely. But there are a few things where it does help a lot, and that's particularly cards where it's not very easy to get multiple copies of them. So against black market, they can't buy anything out of the black market effectively because as soon as they gain it, they have to exile it. Now they still get any on-gain effects, whatever, but it hurts a lot. Tournament, any prizes they would get, they would gain. They're never going to be able to get them back, right? So if they're under Gatekeeper attack, it's gone. It's gone. Knights all have different names. They're never going to be able to, get them. And the thing about knights is, right, this is a gatekeeper. He's defending a castle, or she. I can't tell. This art that I'm looking at is too small of a version. The gatekeeper is defending the castle. And, knights might be trying to invade that castle, right? And the gatekeeper just squashes that. Boom, bats them down. The gatekeeper stands strong in their way. And that is some strong theme. And if you ignore theme, you're going to lose games of Dominion. Yeah, split piles, once a pile runs out, then, or gets close to running out, then the gatekeeper can be better. But once it runs out, it then obviously also does nothing again. It doesn't do anything against non-action, non-treasure cards. And somehow if you play this and then play cultists afterwards, or play this and then play mountebanks afterwards in the same turn as you played this, then they can exile that copper or the first copy of a ruins. Like, don't do that. Don't do that. This card is very bad. I'm going to give it a 1 out of 10. Not a 0, but a 1 out of 10. I think it's terrible. Hunting Lodge. Hunting Lodge is a 5-cost action. It says plus a card, plus 2 actions. And then you may discard your hand for plus 5 cards. So this is kind of draw to X-ish, kind of minionish in that way. Those decks tend to want villages, so that this is pretty nice for that. The discardy bit is pretty good, as we've seen on Minion. It doesn't give you money like Minion can. It's probably overall still a little better than Minion. It can work with other draw, right? Like, just like it's a village that, like, after you've drawn with a smithy or something, you just play it as a normal village too. So it works fine with those. And sometimes you just like pitch your hand looking for better stuff, right? Lower dud chance, that kind of thing. So yeah, this card's super solid. 7 or an 8. I'm gonna say a 7. Kiln is a 5-cost action, plus 2 money. The next time you play a card this turn, you may first gain a copy of it. So you gain the copy before you play the card. If you have a lot of deck control, and particularly plus action, you can do some gain and play stuff with this. In that case, it's quite strong. Otherwise, it's kind of hard to do gain and play with it effectively, and gaining another payload card, gaining another, whether that's a treasure or a terminal that you play after this, is It's fine to good, but it's not amazing. I think this tends to be a little bit worse than Haggler. I'm going to give this a 5 out of 10, I think. In those situations where you do have good deck control and good villages, you can potentially really explode with gain and play and gain and play and gain and play and gain and play, like kiln for a kiln to get more kilns and pile the kilns out and be very explosive that way, but that's not going to happen very often. Let's move on next to Livery. Livery is a 5 cost action card that gives +3 money, and this turn when you gain a card costing 4 or more, gain a horse. Note that this is not a below the line while this is in play. It's a play effect, so if you throne room this, you're going to get 2 horses for every card you gain that costs 4 or more. It does stack playing multiple of them, you get multiple horses. This card is extremely good. This is, I think I'm going to give this a, is it a 9 or a 10? I'm going to give this a 9 out of 10, but I wouldn't fault you for giving it a 10 out of 10. So the thing is, 3 money is a lot of money, and then gaining a horse, again, it's like it drew a card on the average if you're getting 1 thing per turn. If you're getting 2 things per turn, then it's like it's drawing you cards on average. If you're getting 3 things per turn, it's drawing you more cards on average, right? Assuming that they cost more than 4, or 4 or more. It can just draw you so many cards as a payload card. It effectively draws you a lot of cards that it's very, very powerful. And then if you're just playing like a single gain, like you're just playing money, 3 money is really good, and then drawing a little bit, which can't draw dead, is also quite good in those situations. So like it's basically always good. Sometimes it's very good. The one case where it's not that good is if you're trying to get a lot of cheap things. So for whatever reason your board is just like all about the things that cost 3 or less, and you want to get a lot of those, Livery is not that good there. Or with cost reduction, right? With cost reduction, that makes things cost less than 4, you're not getting your horses. If you're not getting your horses, it's not very good. But like, especially if you're getting multiple things that cost more than 4 in a turn, this card is absolutely very, very good. Let's move on to, you know what? I'm giving Livery a 10. We're doing it. 10 out of 10. Mastermind. Mastermind is a 5 cost action duration. At the start of your next turn, you may play an action card from your hand 3 times. Now, the art on this, I think, Adam thinks, a lot of people think, it looks a lot like Adam. Now, apparently they didn't ask the artist to do anything. Nobody knew about this until they saw the art. I kind of still think the artist, on their own accord, like found a picture of, like it looks a lot. Some other people have said that it looks like Nicolas Cage, you know, from like the National Treasure or Ghost Rider or Con Air, you know, those movies. It's probably really dating myself with the Con Air reference, but yeah, I remember that movie. I don't think Adam looks like Nick Cage, but people think that this card looks like both of them. I don't know, your mileage may vary. Let's talk about what it does. So it's a 5 cost action duration. At the start of your next turn, you may play an action card from your hand 3 times. Oh, it's like King's Court, but it's King's Court next turn, and it does nothing for you now. It costs 5. You can only play it like half the turns. So it's like I think it's a lot worse than King's Court. Having said that, it's still pretty good. Let's talk about chaining these. So if you mastermind a mastermind, then you play the mastermind 3 times. Both masterminds stay out, and you can keep chaining them longer. Now, if I mastermind a mastermind, I play a mastermind on turn 1. On turn 2, I have it triple a mastermind. On turn 3, I get 3 action plays, right? So if I would have just played mastermind, I get to play 3 actions 3 times each. So that's a total of 9 action plays. If on turn 1 I just played mastermind, I get 3 action plays on turn 2. And then on turn 2, I just played a mastermind, I get 3 action plays on turn 3. It looks like I've gotten 3 more action plays. But I haven't played the mastermind on turn 3, which I might have been able to do on turn 3 if I didn't mastermind the mastermind, which would give me 3 more action plays on turn. Anyway, the point is, if you chain the masterminds, you get slightly more action plays in the long run, but it's only slightly more. Now, you don't have to draw the masterminds because they stay out. So that's a positive. On the negative side of chaining them, you don't get to get the benefit as quickly. So you get, probably that means you get worse cards now, which is, I think, often, if not usually, going to be a bigger impact than getting the slightly more action plays eventually. So I actually think in a lot of cases you don't want to chain these, although it's not strictly worse. It's not always worse, and sometimes you might want to chain them. But I think a lot of cases you don't. But it is kind of close. And because chaining KC into KC is so powerful and so much of it's powerful, I think that even though this only costs 5, it's like significantly worse than King's Court. And I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10. I could maybe see 9, but I think I only want to give it an 8 out of 10. Let's move on to Paddock. Paddock is a 5-cost action, gives you +2 money. Gain 2 horses. We see that text again. And then +1 action per empty supply pile, which is a little bit of an odd text. But yeah, 2 money and 2 horses. This is pretty good for a money deck. Like, draw 2 cards and +2 cards +2 money would be good enabler for money in a lot of cases, and this can't draw dead. And then eventually this might be non-terminal. It's not great for that kind of a deck. It's a little bit of payload and draw, so it's kind of good in any deck, but it's not really like great until a supply pile gets empty, which it's kind of hard to count on, and you can maybe play around that happening as an opponent, kind of like with City, although less importantly. The problem is, like, they're terminals, so you can't just totally load up on these without any villages very often. You kind of need the village support here. Mostly it helps you then add an influx of terminals later, but it's just not that useful. If somehow you can get a pile empty very quickly, then you can anticipate for it. If you can get 2 piles empty very quickly, you can use this as a village, but that's pretty rare. Yeah, I think this is a solid but not great card. It's a 6 out of 10. Sanctuary. 5-cost action, plus a card, plus an action, plus a buy. You may exile a card from your hand. It's not compulsory. You may. So this is in a long line of Junk Dealer, Sentry, Upgrade, that kind of card. It gives a buy, which is nice, and it exiles, which is better for getting rid of green cards. So, like, you can get rid of your provinces with this, and it's a little bit better for getting rid of your estates. That is really nice, but it's a little bit worse at dealing with curses. But it is optional, which is a nice plus, and the plus buy is a pretty big deal. Yeah, I think you will very usually want 1 to 2 copies of this to, like, help you get rid of your provinces, help you thin early. It's very good to do that. A little bit worse probably early on than, say, Junk Dealer or Upgrade maybe. But in the same ballpark, and better sometimes, because the plus buy can make it better later. And this is an 8 or a 9. I think I'm going to give this a 9 out of 10. Next is Fisherman. It's a 5-cost action, plus a card, plus an action, plus a money. And then during your turns, if your discard pile is empty, this costs 3 less. So everyone's Fishermen's cost 3 less during turns where the player whose turn it is has an empty discard pile. Just to keep that in mind. There's some really weird stuff with manipulating this for trash for benefit. Mostly it's a cheap peddler when your discard pile is empty, so at the start of your shuffle, if you trigger a shuffle. Peddlers are good cards. I think this is a good card. It's not like a world beater at all. Sometimes you can do some cute stuff with the cost increase of it. You're rarely going to want to buy this for 5, but you're often going to get it for 2. I'm going to give it a 6 out of 10. Destrier. Destrier is a 6-cost, although more on that in a second. It gives plus 2 cards, plus an action. But then it says during your turns, this costs 1 less per card you've gained this turn. Again, this applies to everybody. It's just the active player's turn, how many cards they've gained on the turn. So 6 cost for a lab is not very good. 5 cost for a lab is okay. Cheaper than that gets to be pretty darn good. I think this card is good, but you might have dreams of getting a ton of them, and I think that's going to be pretty hard to do or hard to do effectively. To gain a lot of cards on a turn, you usually need to be drawing well already, at which point getting lots of these, like you're already drawing well already. Having said that, once you're drawing well, often you need to keep adding draw in order to keep drawing the extra like payload or green cards that you're adding, and Destrier has your back at that point. So I think it's not something you're going to get early very often, but it's going to be like the supplemental draw that you add later on very often when it gets to be cheap, and it's pretty good for that. But like it's not going to transform what kind of deck you're building very often. I'm going to give this a 7 out of 10. Wayfarer, 10 out of 10. I think this is the strongest card in this set. So it costs 6. Again, more on this later. It says plus 3 cards. You may gain a silver. Notice that it's a may. And then it has a dividing line. It says, this has the same cost as the last other card gained this turn, if any. So what that means is whatever the last card you gained this turn is, if you've gained a card this turn, this costs the same as that. Whatever cost that is now, not when you gained it, but what it is now. So if that cost changed, it's what it is now. Cost changing effects on this only apply to Wayfarer, basically, if you haven't gained a card, or if they also apply to the card that you gained. So, for instance, if I play a bridge and I buy a silver, then this costs 2 because the silver that I bought cost a 2. Or if I gain a silver with this costs 3. If I then subsequently play a bridge, this costs 2 because the silver costs 2, and this doesn't get an additional discount from the bridge. If I put my fairy token on the Wayfarer pile, then the Wayfarers cost 4. But then if I gain a card, they cost what that card costs. So like if my fairy token is on Wayfarer and then I gain a silver, the Wayfarer costs 3. It doesn't cost 1, it doesn't cost 4, it doesn't cost 6, it costs 3 for the rest of that turn. If I gain, let's say, a village, vanilla village, and then I move my fairy token to the Wayfarer pile, then Wayfarers will still cost 3, not 4, not 1. They still cost 3, right? Okay. So it's a little bit tricky, but basically it's any cost reduction effects take a place, and then this copies the current cost of what the last gained card this turn was. Okay, that's basically how it works. And that's a semi-unwritten rule that is kind of implied in the rule book. But yeah. Anyway, notice that if you have a junking attack, you're giving out a curse or a ruin. Curses and ruins cost 0, and it doesn't say you gained this turn. It says gained this turn by any player, right? So that's something. Notice that spoils, mercenaries, prizes, those all cost 0 as well. Madman costs 0, but you can't gain a Madman and then be gaining this after, I don't think, in the same turn. So that's not relevant. But with just like lots of plus buy, you can get a lot of these cheap. Like if I just have 7 buys, I might buy a copper at some point in my buy sequencing so that I can buy some of these for 0, right? It's potentially possible to make this more expensive if you're trying to do some trash for benefit stuff. So there's some synergies with trash for benefit that way. It self-synergizes because you gain the silver. That makes it cost 3. The effect, I guess we should talk about the effect. So it's a smithy where you can gain a silver. Smithy is a good card at 4. It's an okay card at 5 you'll play sometimes. Gaining the silver is a pretty good effect. Like I was talking about with Groom earlier, gaining silvers is a good way to increase your payload because you don't have to spend buys or gains on it. You can spend your other gains to get more deck control. So that's good there. Also, it then makes these Wayfarers cheaper, maybe. There's, what else? If you just want to gain cheap cards, Wayfarer gets better. You want plus buys typically. The effect, I think the effect of plus 3 cards you may gain a silver would be probably about in the Swashbuckler range if it costs 5. And that's a card you're often pretty happy to buy at 5. Like, it's worse than the attacks at 5, and it's worse than Wharf. Probably worse than Barge. I say the attacks. It might be better than Haunted Woods in terms of your 5-cost smithies. But you're usually often and probably usually going to be buying this for less than 5, at which point it's a steal. It's a steal when you can get it cheap. Yeah, it's just a great card. And it can lead to some pileouts, so watch for pileouts as this being a cheap pile if you have a lot of gains. Let's move on to the last card. Finally, this set review is going to be done. Animal Fair. Animal Fair costs 7 star. Says plus 4 money, plus a buy per empty supply pile. And then there's a horizontal line that says, instead of paying this card's cost, you may trash an action card from your hand. So the biggest use for this is turn 1 or 2, you trash your Necropolis, you get this, and suddenly you're hitting 6 reliably, you're hitting 8 with pretty good chance if you want to. There's some chance you don't want to open with a silver just on the other turn, just so that you still have a 10-card deck and make sure that the Animal Fair doesn't miss the shuffle. My guess is you still usually want to get another card. But it just skyrockets up your money so fast that you can be getting 5s and 6s very reliably, very quickly. By trashing the Necropolis for this early on. Trashing other things for it, like usually the other actions you wanted to have in your deck, but maybe they've outlived their usefulness. Maybe you're trying to pile this thing out. This has really good synergies with Trash for Benefit because it costs 7 and it can be cheaper. Maybe the thing you're trashing for it was like a Lackeys that had mostly an on-gain effect, or a Rat or something. It can be good in all those situations. Plus 4 money is okay payload. Occasionally I will pay 7 for this. Also, just like in a money deck, it's pretty good payload. But like, you have to keep in mind that in a money deck, you're probably spending your buy on the turn for this, as opposed to, so you're losing not only the thing you're trashing to this, but also the card you would have had in your deck, at which point it's a pretty slim upgrade, if one at all, especially considering terminal space might be an issue. Once piles empty, 4 money and a buy is actually pretty good payload. If 2 piles empty, you can get a ton of buys out of this and really have a, like, the 3rd pile will empty basically after that. Yeah, this card is decent but not great. It's a 4 or a 5. I think I'm going to give it a 4 out of 10 overall. That does it for this review of Dominion Menagerie. Looks like we're about 3 hours. I'm tired. I've talked a lot. I need to drink something. See you guys later with a real episode. Thanks for watching. Like, comment, all that stuff. You go to my YouTube channel. You go to Adam YouTube's channel. AdamHorton.com. The Making Luck Discord. Carrier pigeon. Post-it note. Smoke signals. However you want to contact us. Leave your comments. Say how you disagree. Catch up with you later. Thanks for listening, everybody.